Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm a bit of a Luddite as far as Zoom is concerned. But anyway, very good morning to everybody. My name is Ros Artis. I'm the Director of the Scottish Lime Centre Trust. And we have been operating for over 25 years and dedicated to the appropriate repair of traditional buildings, very often using lime mortars, but that's not entirely the whole story. So we were established in 1994 as a not-for-profit organisation, and we have two main sides to what we do. So we have our training and education programme delivered from two training centres, one here in Charlestown Workshops, and then at Maryhill, our all-weather training centre just a wee bit north of us, but just 4 miles from Inverkeithing. And we provide a wide range of courses on the use of lime for the repair of buildings and structures, and more generally on building conservation issues, attracting national and international audiences. Our training programme is informed by our building advisory service, where we provide specialist advice through building surveys, inspections and investigations. And Stacey will go into a lot of this as part of our Stone and Slate survey of Inverkeithing. But crucially, we have our own laboratory for the analysis and testing of building materials, including stone, slate, mortar, brick as well. And you can just see from the images here in front of you, we get involved in all sorts of buildings and structures. So it could be a ruined structure, it could be interior decorative plasterwork, and then you see Queensberry House, part of the Scottish Parliament complex, resplendent with its reinstatement of lime finishes, which I think provides a good contrast to the upturned boats modern part of the Scottish Parliament. And we're based in Charlestown, which is just on the north shore of the Forth River, just west of Inverkeithing. And the image you see here is 14 historic lime kilns dating from the 1760s, which was the largest lime producing complex in the whole of the UK, and produced over a third of Scotland's lime resources. And it wasn't always used for just building, but also for sweetening the land, for agriculture, and for the production of iron and steel and many other industrial processes. And you can just see from this cutaway drawing what happens inside a lime kiln, because to most people, the total mass of masonry kind of hides what they do. And essentially they are chimneys, which are loaded with limestone and coal, as you see the guys at the top of the kiln head doing, and then it's set on fire, and the guys at the bottom are drawing out quicklime through draw holes, and that's the product material from a lime kiln. And off it went on ships and boats, and transported all up the east coast of Scotland, as far as Orkney, Scandinavia, Nova Scotia, unbelievably. So it was a huge industry and very, very important. And you'll just see from a few shots we have here, some live training going on. This is on site in New Lanark, where we're teaching people how to repoint rubble masonry. We have a slating course for the repair of traditional Scottish slate roofs, rubble wall building. And we recognise that many traditional building problems are caused by the inappropriate use of modern repair materials, for example, cement mortars, and or the lack of understanding of traditional building technology, and how these buildings should be repaired and with what materials. So really that's our reason to be. And we look at buildings in a holistic manner, taking into account all the materials employed in their construction, and how they are performing. And we relate this to the detailing of building from the top down, including roof coverings, junctions of different building materials, rainwater goods, wall finishes, ground drainage, and everything else in between. And we want to avoid situations like this, where you see the use of overly hard, dense cement-based mortars accelerating the decay of natural red sandstone masonry in this case. And really what we're trying to achieve is beautiful examples of the use of lime-based mortars and finishes to totally transform buildings. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Emma, who will explain the Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Scheme and the part that 5 historic buildings play with that.
Thank you very much, Roz. If you stop sharing, I'll start. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. Everybody see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So this seminar is delivered as part of the Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Project. The Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Project it's a 5-year project. It began in April 2019. It runs until March 2024. It's a partnership between ourselves at 5 Historic Buildings Trust and 5 Council. The funding for the scheme comes from National Lottery Heritage Fund, 1.2 million. There is 1 million from Historic Environment Scotland, 1 million from 5 Council, and there is some additional further match funding from the Scottish Government, and there will be some private sector investment. The goal of the scheme is to regenerate Inverkeithing and have a heritage-led regeneration. So it's all about the heritage, but we know from past experience and from other schemes that can really kick off a wider regeneration. But heritage is at the heart and at the core of what we're trying to do in Inverkeithing. In this slide, you can see there are 4 main strands to the project, which is managed by a small team of colleagues, some from 5 Historic Buildings Trust and some from 5 Council. So there will be a major uplift to the High Street. The Market Cross will be conserved and moved from its current location, which is a little bit out of the way, back into the main square. The townhouse, which you can see here, is going to be repaired and made accessible, and it will become a community managed, vibrant community hub, and at the heart of the, physically at the heart and emotionally and functionally at the heart of the town. A building repair grant scheme will help private owners to repair and conserve the external fabric and traditional appearance of their buildings. And finally, there's an ambitious training and community engagement programme to raise awareness of traditional building skills and Inverkeithing's heritage in all its forms. And that is aimed at a range of audiences, from homeowners, construction industry, building professionals, school pupils, and the local community. In fact, I want to say community, because we're finding there's people who are interested in and care about Inverkeithing more than those who dwell locally. And the Stone and Slate survey that we commissioned from the Scottish Lime Centre Trust feeds into all of these strands. The survey was commissioned in order to get a better understanding of the condition of the buildings in the conservation area and their repair and maintenance needs, and to identify the most appropriate materials for use in repairs. And we hope that this report and seminar will benefit everyone, from homeowners who want to understand the repair needs of their buildings, to contractors and specifiers and building professionals looking for technical information. So at this point, I will now stop sharing and let you hear what you really came to hear about from the Lime Centre Trust and all of their wonderful work. Thank you.
I will just say quickly, I forgot to say in the beginning, if anybody wants to ask a question, unmute yourself and just ask the question. It's easier that way. I am monitoring the chat as well. So if anybody does put any questions in the chat, I will make it known to the speaker if it's missed. But yeah, if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself. Okay.
Hi there again. I'm just trying to sort this. Okay, all of these iconic A-listed Scottish traditional buildings you see here on this slide have one thing in common. They're all constructed of solid walled masonry, very often utilising natural stone with lime mortar between the stones. The walls are usually 600 mil thick, but very often in fortifications or castles, walls could be very much thicker. And it's the way the stones and or bricks are laid that give structural stability. The mortar serves to cushion the stones and provide weatherproofing. And yet these more mundane buildings, your typical tenement in a town or city, are constructed in exactly the same way, using stone and lime mortar to construct the walls, and very often finished inside with lime plaster and on the outside with lime harling or lime wash on the outside, just like the cottages in the middle bottom shot you see here. The layer of lime harling and lime wash serves to protect the stone walls underneath and to carry decoration, often with coloured lime washes. So why would we actually want to conserve and repair our traditional buildings? What's it all about? Let's have a wee look at a few definitions. So we're kind of reading off the same page. A good explanation of conservation is the action to secure or the survival or preservation for the future of buildings or cultural artifacts, natural resources, energy, or anything of acknowledged value. Restoration, on the other hand, is the process of bringing back a building or part of a building to a simulation of its appearance at a particular period or earlier date. And you might think it's a bit weird that I'm putting up slides of cars and boats, but if you were to restore, repair, conserve a boat or a car, would you use the same materials it was built with? So if you had a walnut dashboard in your antique car, would you repair it with a plastic replica? Probably not, because authenticity is really, really important. If your precious boat made from timber, would you repair it with glass fibre? No, because you value its authenticity. So we've got pretty much 7 guiding lights of conservation, and we should bear these in mind. So minimal intervention, so less is more, the less work you do, the better. Reversibility, so whatever you do to a building should be reversible. Honesty and distinguishability, so repairs should be identifiable, but maybe not sticking out like a sore thumb. Meticulous recording and documentation of a record of what work has been done and with what materials is really important. Avoidance of conjecture, so second guessing what a building might have looked like. A respect for its age and historic patina. So in your conservation project, don't expect a bright and shiny new result. And using the same materials and techniques of repair to maintain the integrity of a building. If we have a look at an example, St Albans Cathedral, this is before restoration, and this is after. Was this based on real evidence or conjecture, second guessing? So the beginnings of modern conservation were promoted by John Ruskin and William Morris, who founded the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. They believed that we were only the custodians of ancient buildings, and looking after them was of paramount importance for future generations. And you can see from the list I'm put up here, there's lots of different charters spanning the latter part of the 20th century, which have tried to put the principles of conservation in a more practical sense. And it's amazing to think that the first Ancient Monuments Act was actually passed in 1882. And there followed many more acts of, for the likes of monuments, listed buildings, conservation areas, and so on throughout the 20th century. Other things we ought to consider, of course, are different aspects of work repair. So that's work to fix or make good a building, fixing missing, broken or slipped stakes, for example, on a roof. Maintenance, so that's work to a building to avoid problems developing. So cleaning out your gutters twice a year to prevent blockages, or painting window frames and rainwater goods every 8 years or so. And intervention, so that could be an action which has a physical effect on the fabric of a building. Good example would be installing a Velux window on a roof. So conservation will almost certainly involve all or some of the following: repairs, maintenance, conservation, and restoration. And modern Scottish conservation practice is guided by a series of documents. So we have the Historic Environment Policy for Scotland and the British Standard on the Guide to Conservation of Historic Buildings. The Historic Environment Scotland Policy 2019 gives guidance on a whole host of things, including scheduled ancient monuments and listed buildings, conservation areas, and sets the scene of the role of government bodies in this respect. So if we have a look at a couple of different aspects, so scheduled ancient monuments, and a good example are the historic kilns we have here in Charlestown. So the Historic Environment Scotland maintains a schedule or a list of monuments of national importance, and the aim of scheduling is to preserve our most significant sites and monuments as far as is possible in the form in which they've been passed down to us today. And not too far away from us at Dunfermline Abbey, the palace and nave are scheduled ancient monuments as well. But these can be all sorts of different structures. So more latterly, we've got Second World War gun emplacements being scheduled as important monuments of our history. If we have a look at listed buildings, these buildings enrich our landscape and chart a great part of our history. Many buildings are of interest architecturally or historically, but to be listed, a building must be of special architectural, cultural, or historic interest. And Historic Environment Scotland list buildings of special architectural or historical interest, and they have a dedicated team who research and assess all these designations. And listed buildings have characteristics that help to create Scotland's distinctive character, are a highly visible and accessible part of our rich heritage. They express our social and economic past. They can span a huge range of uses and periods of construction, and they contribute significantly to our sense of place. And they can also reflect many aspects of life, including education, recreation, worship, housing, industrial buildings, defensive buildings. So there's a whole range. And which buildings are considered for listing? So Historic Environment Scotland operates a designation policy and selection guidance. And all of these documents are available to download from the Historic Environment Scotland website. So if we focus in on listed buildings, they're divided into 3 different categories, A, B, and C. So category A buildings are of special architectural or historical interest on a national or international level. So here we've got Rosslyn Chapel in Midlothian, which is an A-listed building. Here we've got Wardlaw Mausoleum, which is a B-listed building, where the architecture or period or style of the building has regional or local importance and may have been subject to some alterations. And C-listed buildings, here we've got our own building, Charlestown Workshops, which was the former estate workshops for Broom Hall Estate, the seat of the Earl of Elgin. And this is a building of local importance and has had alterations. If you just look on to the right-hand side of the shot, there's a new timber frame construction as an addition to the building. So when a building is listed, it's illegal to alter, extend, or demolish the building internally or externally without listed building consent. And that's issued by the local planning authority. And it's the local planning authority, in this case Fife Council, who decide whether listed building consent is required or not. Usually, routine maintenance and repair using like-for-like materials does not require listed building consent. This is an example of some cottages, which is actually in the west coast of Scotland. They'd actually lost their original harled finishes and lime washed finishes through lack of maintenance. And so the reinstatement of harled and lime washed finishes actually required listed building consent because it materially altered the external appearance of the buildings. So how many listed buildings do we have in Scotland? We've got around 47,000 listed buildings in Scotland, and in Fife we enjoy the second highest number of listed buildings next to Edinburgh. So 8% of our listed buildings are category A listed, 60% are category B listed, and 32% are category C listed. And the example you see here is Bankton House in East Lothian. You'll see it if you go along the A1 going east, coming out of Edinburgh. So how do you know if your building is listed or not? You can contact your local planning authority, or you can search Historic Environment Scotland's website portal. The other aspect, which is very relevant to Inverkeithing, because not all of Inverkeithing's heritage regeneration scheme covers the entire conservation area of Inverkeithing, but it does reflect concentrations of groups of buildings of special architectural or historic interest. They may not all be listed, but as a grouping of buildings and a townscape, they warrant some conservation area protection. So that can be open spaces. So that's the open space you see in Inverkeithing, which originally housed markets and fairs and so on. It might be things like planned towns and villages or particular street patterns. And as with listed buildings, conservation areas are also designated under the same Planning Act of 1997. And conservation areas are usually designated by local planning authorities, and they must meet certain criteria. They must be of special architectural or historic interest, the character or appearance of which is desirable to preserve or enhance. And Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration Programme fits that bill very nicely. So if we look around Fife, we've got a number of conservation areas, and they can include our fishing ports along the East Neuk of Fife. We've got 48 conservation areas in all. Here in Charlestown, we have our own conservation area, which is a planned village built around the workplace, the lime works at Charlestown. And then Inverkeithing, a good example of a grouping of buildings from different eras, but collectively preserving the building lines of a typical medieval borough in Scotland, comprising a rig pattern of development with mainly traditional stone and slated buildings fronting onto the main street with narrow plots of land or rigs behind them. And Inverkeithing has a surprisingly rich architectural heritage ranging from medieval times through the succeeding centuries right up until the 20th century. Some of the most prominent buildings along Inverkeithing's main street date from the 19th century and utilise both the local hard and dense dolerite building stone and several local and not so local sources of blonde and red sandstone buildings. So interventions can be made by local planning authorities for things like unauthorised works or alterations or extensions to listed buildings, dangerous buildings, because local authorities are ultimately responsible for public safety, for planning permissions, repair and maintenance issues, and the giving of building warrants. Other things we ought to think about as well are the protection of flora and fauna. And this can mean things like nesting bats, which means that works might not necessarily be able to be carried out when they're nesting in buildings. And the same goes for the protection of nesting protected birds. So if we have a look at the influences of geography and geology on our traditional buildings, we can see, if I can put my cursor on this, I don't know if it will work. Okay, so you can see the red here of the granite around Aberdeen. You see these anomalies in Dumfries and Galloway and Dalbeattie, for example, which has granite. We have vast swathes of grey wacky and red sandstone in Dumfries and Galloway. And in Fife, we have predominantly blonde sandstones, and that was the focus of our Stone and Slate survey, which Stacey will present a bit later. But also whinstone in Fife was used extensively, the dolerite I mentioned, which is local to Inverkeithing. And interestingly, in Fife, there is no natural roofing materials other than thatch available historically. And so all the slated roofs you see in Fife are brought in from other parts of Scotland. And Auchtermuchty was actually the sort of centre for the thatching heritage of Fife. But of course, where we have geology and geology, and we have the Carboniferous geological series running through Fife, that means that we have deposits of fire clay, and that was utilised in the production of pan tiles, drainage pipes, and so on. And so that's why you see pan tiles so prevalent in Fife, on Fife roofs. And because these materials used for buildings were relatively heavy, historically it was the horse and cart that was used to transport these materials on shorter distances, or by boat or ship for longer journeys. So at Charlestown, at the historic lime works, we have the harbour right next to the lime works, and that's where the lime left in larger quantities. And then later we saw horse-drawn railways, and then later by locomotive railways and canals, spreading the distribution of building materials to a far wider network. And then, of course, we've got roads and vehicles transporting materials. So traditional buildings in Dunfermline, for example, are very often in the local blonde sandstone, which naturally weathers to a grey colour. Hence the name for Dunfermline is the Old Grey Toon. If we transport ourselves up to Aberdeen, for example, we'll find that the buildings are, or the historic buildings at least, are predominantly of granite construction. And here we see coursed squared rubble. Granite's an igneous material produced by volcanoes. And because these building materials were generally bulky and heavy, like stone, slate, lime, sand, and timber, they were all won by hard labour and with very little mechanization at first. And as a result, the embodied human energy put into producing traditional buildings is enormous in terms of man hours. And if we have a look at the relationship between traditional building materials, construction methods, and resultant building forms, we find that in rural areas, we usually have quite low-rise buildings, 1 or 1.5 stories buildings, very often with dormer windows, which is a particularly Scottish feature of traditional buildings. But in more urban settings, and Inverkeithing is a good example of this, it's usually about 2.5 stories and up to 4 and more stories in our larger towns and cities. Window openings are usually furnished with sliding sash and case windows, which are set well back from the wall face with an ingo of around 6 inches, giving added protection from driving rain. It's quite interesting if you travel on a train from Scotland right through down to the south of England. At various points, you'll see that windows are set more closely to the wall face as you go south, and that reflects in our weather and driving rain that we have in Scotland, which is less of an issue as you go further south of the border. I mentioned earlier that in 5-pan tiles might be used really for more simple roof forms, and slate was better suited to forming more complex roof shapes with things like dormers, valley gutters, and other interruptions. So if we look at traditional buildings, and we normally denote those by being built prior to 1919, and this 1919 sort of cut-off date is not entirely watertight, but basically buildings post 1919 were usually of a different type of construction. So not when we move from solid wall construction to things like cavity wall construction, steel frame, and all the other myriad of different construction types we've seen in the 20th century. But because traditional buildings are eminently repairable and adaptable using like-for-like materials, so the fact that we have lime mortar between stone units, for example, means that we can recover these stone units and adapt buildings, change their layout more easily. They're more sustainable in the long term, as long as you have good maintenance. Timber sash and case windows are also examples of features that can be repaired relatively easily and upgraded to reduce drafts. But if we compare this to modern construction, most modern construction products are mass-produced, things like bricks, concrete blocks, cement, etc., and many are man-made. For example, UPVC windows, MDF, and the timbers we use today are treated with preservatives, all requiring vast amounts of embodied energy. Modern construction usually involves high levels of insulation incorporated into the design with things like rock wool or insulated plasterboard. And these materials are then placed in a fashion that doesn't easily allow for their adaptation. And when components fail, they're simply thrown away and replaced with new ones. So if your UPVC window fails, you basically chuck it in a skip, which is not a very sustainable way to go about things. And I think probably this last year of pandemic, etc., I think people have maybe navel gazed a bit more and thought how they use resources, and are slowly realizing that our throwaway society is maybe not a good plan, and that we should be looking at things in a much more sustainable way. So I'll finish up there and hand over to Stacey, who has very kindly come back to share her findings of the Stone and Slate survey of Inverkeithing.
Yes, hello everyone. It has been a little while though since I have done Zoom presentation, so please bear with me if I do this wrong. Can everyone see this okay? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, good. So as I said, I am or was the building surveyor here. I still am a building surveyor. I am now at a different company, all about new builds and lease plans and everything. So my conservation brain has been totally switched off. It's actually really nice to get back into what I was immersed in for 6 years. So I will be going through the findings of our Stone and Slate survey in Inverkeithing. I will caveat this right at the beginning, just to say we actually did not analyze any slate as of yet, just due to access issues. We didn't want to start pulling slates off buildings, and we had intended on analysing the slates from the town hall because there was a project due to start, and because of the pandemic it has been delayed. So essentially we haven't completed that section yet, but we have made visual assessments on that scope of things. But just in case anybody spots that, I will caveat it right at the beginning. So what we will go through is just a broad summary of what we found, the stone types that were found, maintenance issues that were found, the stone condition generally that was observed, modern interventions and materials that were found, and then a little bit on chimneys and gable ends, because it is a common issue in all towns. So I thought this might be a good picture to sort of give a little summary on what was found in Inverkeithing. It might be a little bit obscure, but it kind of does generalize what we found. There was a myriad of stone types, sandstone, dolerite, and a few other bits and pieces in between. A lot of original lime mortars, which was very interesting, including halling finishes. There was also some modern interventions and alterations. As you can see, that used to be an opening in the middle there, and with alterations come with modern materials and the issues that those pose to traditional construction. And then sometimes the vegetation takes over as a result of a lack of maintenance. And sometimes that causes some real issues, and Ros will go into that in more depth later on, but I will be touching on that in this as well, because it was a major finding of the survey, as it is in nearly every survey. And so yeah, this little unassuming boundary wall is a good summary for Inverkeithing. So in general, we found 5 stone types, 4 of which were sandstone, 1 of which was dolerite, which is very common for for Inverkeithing. There still is a Whinstone quarry, which is now used for road aggregate. As I said, lots of lime mortars and finishes, original mortars we found in abundance compared to a few other towns that we've done these sorts of surveys in. Lack of maintenance, again, a common issue, and it is a common issue where there are buildings with multiple owners and often vacant landlords. Organising shared repairs is a little bit of a difficult thing, and it often gets left to the last. However, what we did find was that generally the stone was in good condition or fair condition, but the lack of maintenance issues and modern materials used were causing quite specific issues. And these issues could be quite severe in some cases. And this is a little overview. I won't go into this too much because Katie will be obviously giving her findings on the stone and mortar analyses. But it just gives a little general overview of the stone types that we found and where we found them. As you can see, it's quite evenly distributed apart from stone types 1 and 2, which are found more in the older section of the town. So towards the north of the high street. And there are also quite a number of rendered and painted buildings, which could be in response to the stone type and condition of the stone type at the time, and the quality of the stone. So we found quite a number of alterations, as is normal in a town that expands and keeps up to date with modern times. However, we did find this curious apparatus, which is behind the town hall. The adjacent property, I think it's at the back of the Cadora Cafe, and it was actually installed to allow the top flat owner's cat to safely get to the ground, if anybody was wondering, because we were, and that's what we were told. And along with the curious little step ladder situation, you can also see there is quite a bit of neglect. It's usually the story with the rear of buildings because they get forgotten about, and particularly this one because maybe a little bit of the access issues because it is the cemetery for the church. But you can see there's quite significant ivy growth. It's maybe not quite as easy to see, but there is some empty joints in the masonry below the ivy, which it has kind of taken hold. And generally just doesn't look that great because there's a lot of water runoff. Obviously, there might be some issues there with the gutter. And these sorts of issues are, again, a kind of common occurrence. But this is a little bit of a extreme example. Here we have the half crown, which was formerly known as the Royal Hotel. I think probably quite a long time ago. It's listed as the Royal Hotel. As I was saying, some of the stone types are of a poorer quality, and usually these were the buildings that are rendered. However, when looking at old photos, it's not necessarily only, sorry, I'm just admitting people into the room. I'm trying to multitask. It's not only in response to the stone type being poor. There was also, other reasons to cover buildings, not necessarily only with render, but paint as well. And so it can't always be used as an indicator to think that, okay, well, that stone type must have been poor, that's why it's covered now. And just keep in mind this, where's my cursor? This section over here. As you can see to the far right, that is the half crown, or the Royal Hotel as it was, and that opening is now filled in, obviously, with walls and a smaller window. But as you can see, it is treated with something, probably a lime wash. White, it appears. I know it's black and white photo, but it's white in color. So we can maybe assume, here's another photo, probably older, as the openings are more regular now, also again on the far right. So we cannot then assume that the render finish that's on it now was maybe in a response to it being of a poorer stone type, but maybe it was actually always lime washed or protected in some way. And maybe that was from an understanding of, how stone buildings weather and that a lime wash coating or a render or hull coating would protect the stone long term. And obviously that understanding has been lost a little bit over the time, and now we're getting back to that understanding. But it's in Inverkeithing particularly, we have got some evidence that quite a number of buildings were actually lime washed from a very early stage, probably for protection, but also possibly for decoration. So as I said, we found a lot of lime mortar, a lot of original lime mortars, and it was quite interesting to assess the different samples, because it showed the developments of industry over time. The older samples were more non-hydraulic, mostly non-hydraulic, quite crude mortars with a much finer aggregate, ranging all the way up to more modern mortars, or hydraulic mortars, probably sourced from Charlestown, and a bit more sophisticated, a little bit coarser aggregate as the understanding of mortars kind of expanded. So here is a little range of mortars that we analysed. The top left is from the town hall. The middle top is from the Bank Street Salon, and the Harling mortar found from the rear of the town hall is in the top right. And then at the bottom, we have a possible repointing mortar, very early repointing mortar from a vinyl wall on Port Street. And so you can kind of see the differences. Obviously in age, the town hall mortar is obviously a lot older and has degraded a little bit more from weathering, and the Vinyl Street repointing mortar is a lot newer, but it is quite sharp and has a lot of intact pieces, which is more indicative of a hydraulic mortar because it's stronger. And again, Katie will talk more in depth about this. I'm just touching on, just the general findings that we have seen in Inverkeithing. But it is a really good thing that we found so many original intact mortars, quite easily accessible as well, quite close to the surface, and in most parts quite good condition, which is unusual. Like I said, it might be because in Inverkeithing, some of the buildings were a little bit more sheltered than we usually find on the coast. And here we have, this is Thompson's lodging. And why we speak so much about vernacular architecture is because it relates to the proximity of building materials. So the materials that were at hand, close by, easily available. And it is a visual and physical representation of these local materials and weather conditions, a little bit as to what Ros was describing before. So a simple rubble building with a lime hull and a clay pantel roof might be quite aesthetically charming, but it is also a representation of the materials that were available at the time. So Thompson's lodging is a rubble building which is hulled. This is a more recent lime hulling, probably with either a copper ass lime wash or a lime wash that was colour matched to copper ass. And this is very typical, particularly with the clay pan tiles. If you ignore the other section with the concrete tiles on it, it's a very typical method of construction in Fife. As Inverkeithing is on the coast, sorry, still is, it had the advantage of being able to source materials and transport things via the sea. And that's probably why, as I'm not sure if Katie will mention or not, but there was an abundance of oyster shells, as there were for any coastal towns, and these were very easily burnt quite crudely to make lime mortars. And there was a study, or a small excavation and archaeological study done in 1982 because a building was demolished just at the end of Bank Street to construct a new building. And there was a lot of evidence of clamp kilns, which are very simple kilns, just a hole dug in the earth, a fire built, and the limestone, or oyster shells in this case, put on top and left burn. And that was commensurate with quite a lot of the mortars that we found in older buildings, very simple non-hydraulic mortars, burnt on site usually. So maintenance is a big thing. We'll probably bang on about it quite a bit, but it's a very, very common issue, and it's something that we find nearly every building survey, every town. There will be an item or a defect that is caused by a lack of maintenance. Ros is going to, as I said, speak a little bit more about maintenance in general, but it is a major finding of this stone survey, and it has been in every town survey that we've done. We did a small one in Kincardine, and obviously another big one in Cooper. And we will be probably, like I say, repeating it over and over again, but it is important. Cleaning gutters isn't glamorous, but it costs pennies compared to repointing stone or replastering internal walls, and that's if you're lucky. So here are some nice Badlier shots, very, very common occurrence, but it can be quite extensive and very destructive, and not something you should just get round to doing. They should be nipped in the bud, literally. The top right image is a remaining bit of skew cope that was from a demolished building. And that bit of Badlier is quite well established, and that skew cope, I'm not sure if you can quite tell, but it is actually loose, and it has been dislodged by the growth of that Badlier. So you can see that vegetation, not only being a little bit unsightly, can be quite disruptive and structurally damaging. And it's usually found at wall heads, and that can have serious implications for water penetration and defects found further down the wall, and particularly internally. But yes, it doesn't look great when you have a great big vegetation, big, huge Badlier growing out of your skew copes. This was the same area taken a bit later in the year in August, after it had a bit of the nice warm summer to grow even more. Not sure, haven't been back to Inverkeithing to see if it has been chopped down yet or not, but no doubt it'll come back again. So here is Mary's Meals on the High Street. This was it still is a problem building in many ways. The gutter here stops short of the skew, and so it doesn't catch all the rainwater. The gutter and the downpipe are choked with vegetation, and as a result, water is just cascading down the face of the wall. Here, the main stone type is dolerite, so it doesn't accept any of the water being basically non-porous, and all the water is being concentrated into the sandstone coins. And as a result, you can see that it probably is quite saturated, and algal growth and vegetation growth has taken hold quite considerably. And in this case, a simple gutter fix and some cleaning probably could have avoided all that. Not to say there's that much damage here, but it's quite considerable at the skew and chimney, which you can't see in this picture, but it is unsightly, and if left can cause quite a lot of damage. This is Thistle Locks at the end of the car park on the High Street. This was used as a sample building for sampling stone. because it has the stone type SS4, one of the classifications that we found. It has several issues which we identified which would require repairs, and there was also another reason why we thought a stone core might be justified. Looking at this gable end, I wonder if anybody can spot anything that's missing. Something
Chimneys.
like,
Chimneys.
sorry?
Chimneys.
Yep, chimneys. The chimney has been removed and capped in concrete or cement, so there is no ventilation to that flue whatsoever. There is no pots, there is nothing. So apart from looking quite odd to me and probably quite a lot of people, some people don't notice it, but I do. It looks quite odd when a building doesn't have any chimneys or chimney stacks or pots. But because of the reduced ventilation, any water that penetrates the relatively thin masonry at a chimney flue is very easily let in, but they're not very easily let out again. So it is a concentrated bit of saturation, particularly at the head of the gable, because there's a lot more runoff, there's a lot more exposure. And as you can see, the top end of the masonry is in a lot worse of a condition, excluding the ground floor, which has a tide line from splashback from the pavement and the very close proximity to the road. And as a result, the stone has suffered quite considerably. It has been repointed in cement, which hasn't helped either. And this was our sample location. You can see the stone is quite heavily weathered, and the mortar has actually been completely lost. In this case, maintenance, in the term of maintenance, might be actually just checking the stone and then arranging for it to be repointed so that the stone doesn't suffer anymore. However, with this building, there are several factors working against it. Ultimately, because the stone is not as robust as some of the other types found, and it has paid the price basically of poorly thought out alterations and the proximity to the pavement and road. Looking at more interventions, this is the gable end of Papa Jaffa's on the High Street. There obviously has been alterations probably to the chimney location and a poorer stone type on the rubble gable end, which has been replaced with a more modern brick. Not to say it might not be a local brick, because bricks were manufactured locally, but the lower suction and smoother masonry units in conjunction with a very brittle and looks to be very thin coating of cement render has resulted in a lot of debonding, and ultimately a lot of it has been lost. This has the potential to become quite a serious problem, as it will be letting in water into those uncovered sections, but will not be readily allowing it back out again. And it will be concentrating a lot of the water absorption also into the softer masonry units, which you can kind of see just at the junction with the roof of the neighboring building. And these modern materials, and also the very hideous surface repair, if you want to call it that, to the coins on the corner, will all be basically compromising and accelerating the decay to the original historic materials, and it doesn't look very great. So all in all, a very poor example of how modern materials can really cause quite a lot of damage. So we did find a few curious things in Inverkeithing, a few odd things, few nice things, and a lot of them are well documented. Quite a lot of the more important buildings, such as Flora's lodgings, Providence House and Thompson lodging and the like. So we found a few bits that were maybe not on the kind of hit list for Inverkeithing. This is some lovely stained glass, which is actually covered up by a modern shop frontage, probably for protection because it is quite important. It's a turn of the century building. It's the Lindsay and Gilmore Cross Pharmacy, and you can't really see that unless you go inside. And during the pandemic, that's probably as close as I got because I didn't want to actually go inside. But it is worth having a little look inside because it is rather beautiful, because that's all you can see from the outside, and it runs the full length of the shop window. But like I say, the shop front is there actually probably for protection because you wouldn't want to get that vandalized or broken. So it's just a bit of a shame that it's completely covered up. So here is Wilson Solicitors now, which actually was formerly actually an RBS, but originally the National Bank of Scotland, built in 1934. This is actually a newer building replacing the original branch for the National Bank of Scotland, which they decided to site in Inverkeithing because Inverkeithing at the time in 1919 was thought to be a hub following the construction of the Fourth Rail Bridge, and kind of shows the importance of Inverkeithing at the time in Fife and in Scotland, that the National Bank of Scotland decided that it would be the first place for one of their branches. And probably something that gets kind of overlooked. We found it quite interesting for another reason, and that's because it had some really lovely limestone cladding panels, which were probably imported, but you can very, very easily see all of the fossilized sea creatures. Obviously we have a trained eye to look for these things, but they are very easily seen and anybody can walk past and see them. And again, it just shows the importance of this building because imported limestone was quite expensive and was seen as not really lasting very well in Scotland because of the weather, but they've been preserved pretty well. So tenements, there are a number of them in Inverkeithing, probably more than you might realize or more than a small town such as Inverkeithing might be assumed to have, but they are rather, grand and formal. This is a red sandstone tenement, again, probably imported stone from the West Coast, and I think pretty bonny. If we look at the rear, it's constructed in the more local blonde sandstone, and I think the patination, the blackening of the stone is actually quite pleasing. If you just ignore all of the satellite dishes on the back. Another rather formal tenement again on Hope Street, with some modern shop fronts at the bottom, probably letting it down a little bit, but it had some really nice decorative skew putts and really formal ashlar stonework. And on the back, it was actually constructed in dolerite, local dolerite, and red sandstone dressings around openings. So it actually utilized, including brick on the gable end, utilized the full palette of materials available to them. Again, if we ignore the concrete tiles to the back, it is still pretty much as it was built. Again, another tenement. This isn't all of them, I don't think. I think it was this is just a selection. This is on Roman Road with the gable end constructed in local brick. Again, I think quite a pleasing building, and it's an example of how you know, traditionally we built housing. So I've put here last but by no means least, and I think this might be my favorite building in Inverkeithing, and you might think me mad, but this is Baines & Bakers on the High Street. The traffic light spoils the photo a little bit, but I couldn't get rid of that. So there's a few reasons why I like this building, and I think the major one is probably because it's, I think, the only one in Inverkeithing that still has its timber sash and case windows, including those to the bowed dormers on the roof. It's probably the least altered in terms of openings and materials, bar the removal of the chimney pots and the removal of the lime wash on the ground floor. As you can see, there's still a little bit of it remaining, but you can still see the coats of lime wash because it hasn't been fully removed. And the margins and the shop front isn't overly intrusive, but probably could be better, as could be said for most of the shop fronts in Inverkeithing. But I think this is rather a bonny example of what we could have if we just left things alone a little bit. But at the same time, we could maintain them better. Here's a closer-in shot of the bowed dormers. I think the bowed sash and case windows are beautiful, but in dire need of some maintenance. And as you can see, the chimneys do not have any pots on them. There are empty joints to the chimney stacks, and as a result, the stone is suffering slightly. And I will finish on this picture, which are some cobble sets that we found behind the half crown down the alley leading to the houses behind, where we probably spent a little bit too much time looking at the stonework and hauling and sampling of the mortar behind the pub. But it wouldn't be a stone survey if people didn't think we were mad and stone geeks, because that's what we are. So I will finish there, and I think we are now going to have a comfort break, probably for oh no, sorry, I will actually hand you off to Katie, who will be showing you about our findings in the stone and mortar. Take it away, Katie.
Hello everyone, I'm just going to share my screen. So I hope everybody can see that, and I hope you can see me okay. I'm not sure if the camera is very good on this, but here we go. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about the sort of analysis we've done and why we actually need to do this analysis. Now, the reason that we obviously did the sampling and everything, we took into consideration a lot of things about the town, the best places to actually take samples. So I'm going to go into some detail of that, but I'm also going to show you sort of a bit about the geology and the regional geology and why that's so important. So I will just start that now for you. So my name is Dr. Katie Strang, for anybody who doesn't know, and I work in the lab doing the analysis here. And the overview, as I mentioned, a bit about stone and mortar matching and understanding why the materials is important. And then we'll look at the stone story of Inverkeithing, the past, present and future. So that's a bit about the geology. And I just wanted to run some basic definitions with you first, because you'll hear me talking a bit about petrography, and that is when we look at materials under a microscope. And what we do is we prepare these materials to really, really thin sections, which are 30 microns thick, and that is about half the thickness of a strand of your hair. And that means that we can shine light through a polarizing microscope, which picks up distinct characteristics in minerals, and it means that we can then tell you a lot about the material structure and its composition and mineralogy. And here we have a geological map showing mostly the central belt of Scotland, because obviously that's where we're based and where Inverkeithing is. And geology of Scotland is very, very complicated. We have an incredibly rich geodiversity, and that is due to how our landmass has been made up. And that is due to past tectonic events, which have caused mountain building and caused bits of land to be jutted together with different ages of rocks. And the central belt, where we are, is particularly famous for its geology, mostly because of its economic importance. It's the Carboniferous in the central belt, which bears a lot of the coal, which was so important for industry in Scotland. But one of the reasons that we have to match stone is over the last couple of decades, we've seen a revival in the use of stone in construction of new buildings. But that has then in turn sort of increased demands for up-to-date information on where we can get currently available stones locally and within the UK. And because of this renewed interest, it's been prompted in part by environmental concerns and the carbon footprints that are involved in producing and transporting materials, particularly masonry, from other countries to the UK. And because of this, it's meant there's been an increase in native stone being used in conservation, which is absolutely great and what we want to see. But the proper sort of conservation of historic stone buildings should start with your appropriate analysis. Understanding what is going on with the building, what is happening to the masonry, and what kind of deterioration you're seeing in the existing materials. So that would, you would start off by doing a sort of visual survey to assess that, how severe that has got. As well, it's very important to look at the mortar as well, because all these work in unison with each other. And your analysis should always be carried out on the building stone with the lowest degree of weathering or alteration. So rocks don't particularly like to be at the Earth's surface. When they are extracted from a quarry, they then will start to undergo weathering processes, which can change the composition and the texture of the rock itself. But while you're looking at the sort of materials of the building, understanding what was there originally and being able to replace as like for like as possible gives it the best chance of success. And we want to try and conserve the historic fabric of the building as much as we can. And the chemical weathering of building stones, as I mentioned, it occurs over geological timescales far beyond construction dates of buildings. But in more recent times, we're seeing an increased problem, and that is from things like acid dilution of carbonate minerals and cements, sulfate attack on stone surfaces, and that's due to industrial pollution. But then you also get leaching that comes from the use of inappropriate repair materials such as cements. And this picture here on the right-hand side shows you just a typical sort of weathering pattern that you will see around our buildings, some of them in Inverkeithing, where you can see that because of these dark patches in the rock, they're essentially weaker layers, and you get preferential weathering, and it results in this sort of wavy ripple lamination. So it's important to understand how the rocks are behaving when they're actually in the building. And as mentioned, it is important to consider that buildings are composite structures, and it is not just your masonry, your stone in isolation. You need to think about everything else that's there and what's going on. And like things that have already been mentioned by Stacey and Roz, looking into things that might need repaired, things like guttering, there's loads of things to consider, which is why it's incredibly important to take that sort of wider view and look at what the building's function is now. And ultimately, when you're looking at historic building and construction, most of the time, local natural materials were preferred, and that was essentially because they were close by, They required little transport, and a lot of the time people were able to actually open small quarries just to extract material for a short project. And that is all directly influenced by the underlying geology, which is the same across a lot of Scotland. And we think to the north of Scotland, places like Aberdeen, it's very famous for granite deposits, and your buildings there just totally reflect that underlying heritage. But what we need to do is think about why we're needing to match and repair and conserve some of these buildings. So in this image here, you can see that there has been some patch repairs of cement here, and this stone itself is a very soft yellow carboniferous sandstone. And you can see here that around the edges, there is big gaps where you're essentially getting decay of the sandstone because all the moisture is getting trapped in there. And sandstone itself, I'll show you some thin section images soon, is a very porous rock. So it's made up of lots and lots of grains of sand. And because of that, it means there is lots of spaces in between those rocks, and that's what we call porosity. But what is actually really important is the permeability, and that means the ability of the water to actually travel through those pore spaces. And what you find is if you've got a hard material, and that can be a cement, or it could be an inappropriate stone that's been put in, which is way harder than the existing one, you can end up with accelerated decay because water will preferentially go into the weaker material that has more space to absorb that water. And this is another example where there's been some patch repairs, and you can see a quite distinct dark crust on here. Now, you see these quite commonly when there has been periods of things like sulfate attack. Gypsum crust can form in quite a sort of dark black crust, sometimes have quite a knobbly texture to them, but when you see it, it's not particularly nice when you're seeing it on your building. And as well in here, you can see some evidence of leaching. And these things happen due to a lot of different factors. A lot of it's to do with environmental factors and the pollution. And one thing we noticed in Inverkeithing was a lot of these issues, the worst of them were all in the lower courses of the buildings, and that's where you're going to get a lot more moisture, and things like de-icing salts from the roads can have a very big impact as well. So if you've got cars going by along the high street, it's quite busy with traffic, you've got that constant kind of spray going on, and we're not too far obviously from the sea either in Inverkeithing. And this is another example here where you can see the crust forming, and there is some cracks forming as well within the sandstone. So really what I'm trying to sort of get across with these images is that if you don't do the repairs in a sensible and methodical way and understand what was there originally, you can end up actually making the problems worse, which is obviously not what ND wants. And here's another example that we found in one of the buildings where this really hard cement mortar had been put in, and you can just see where it is actually creating massive voids in between the interface between the masonry and your mortar there. And water will just be getting stuck in there, and during winter and things you get periods of cold where you will get freezing, and when water freezes it does expand, and that will cause even more issues with the building itself. And the sandstone, which I'll talk about more, it's quite a soft carboniferous sandstone, so you have to be very careful with what you're actually using, what materials you're going to use with that. Just to go into a bit of context of the actual geology of Inverkeithing itself. Now, Inverkeithing is in such a great place in the central belt. There's a really good reason why the Forth crossings were built where they were, and that is because there is a big volcanic sill which underlies that part of West Fife. This is a geological map from it's the 1850s to 1940s, and this one was published sort of the early 1900s. And now all this green stuff that you can see in here is the big sill, and this is a sill is basically a volcanic intrusion, and what it does is it emplaces in between rock. So when you have your sedimentary rocks, like, for example, sandstone, normally you will see that they will be in beds, and these sills and volcanic intrusions basically exploit the weaknesses in the rock. But these rocks basically became a very, very important resource, particularly around Inverkeithing. And there's a lot of discussion and a lot of historic texts that talk about these stones. So this type of volcanic rock is known to a geologist as a dolerite, but in building terms and in conservation, it's normally referred to as a whinstone, and that just means any dark, hard, crystalline rock. So you know how I said that you get sandstone is made up of individual grains? Well, it's different in an igneous rock because your rock has cooled down from a magma source. It has had time to form crystals, and those crystals are interlocking. And that is why there is a very low porosity and permeability in those types of rocks. But it's been a resource that has been very sort of widely acclaimed throughout history, and a lot of the sort of different transactions and surveys that were done throughout Scotland. And the thing that they really liked about them was that we have a lot of columnar jointing here. Now, the most famous place that you see this is probably the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, but we actually do have a lot of this here in Scotland. And I have a picture here of one. Now, this is not Crooks Quarry. This is not the one near Inverkeithing. This one is slightly further north up the coast. And this columnar jointing just gives you an idea of how vast these were. And the reason that they liked them was because of these columnar joints, they're easily extracted. So they didn't require that much to actually remove them. And these are the sort of whinstone quarries that were round about. So there was loads of them opened up round about Inverkeithing. So this is an old Ordnance Survey map, which is just south of Inverkeithing. You can see all the ones that I've highlighted here, and this one here is a freestone quarry, so that's sandstone. But once you get up to here, you've got your whinstone quarries. And as I said, they were probably just opened up as and when they were required, and where there was a good enough exposure of the rock at the surface, and it didn't require that much digging or extraction to get to. And these are another couple that are situated closer to the town centre of Inverkeithing, but basically Inverkeithing was built on top of these volcanic rocks. And the whinstone, because the whinstone that we've seen throughout Inverkeithing is very, very similar, and it's very, very likely that it was all quarried from a very, very similar source. And we had looked at some of the material from the boundary wall on Hill Street. And that was because that was one of the walls that was easier to get a sample from. And we also went to Crooks Quarry, which isn't actually operating at the moment. And we've got some samples there from the old spoil heaps. Now, when you're looking at these igneous rocks, they look very different to what you'll see the sandstones look like. And that is just, as I said, because they're all these interlocking crystals. And the way that these rocks form, I mean that they have quite a lot of quartz in them, and that makes them very, very hard, which is why nowadays we don't actually quarry this stone as a building stone in Scotland. We do actually normally use it for aggregate, particularly for roads. Because of its hardness, it makes a very, very good surface rock. But it would have been used throughout Inverkeithing, and we saw that it was used a lot in rubble work, and it's probably because it was available. Some of this would have been getting sort of dug up as they were digging foundations, because it's literally the bedrock that is underneath that part of the town. I'm just going to move on to sandstone now, because although Inverkeithing's built on top of this whinstone, sandstone is by far the most prominent building material. And we identified 4 main types of sandstones throughout Inverkeithing that we did summaries of. And before we went to look at sort of the quarries that they may have come from, it's a good idea to look at literature and try and find out. And we know that there was a lot of carboniferous formations throughout Fife that were exploited for building stone, but the building stone was normally actually just a consequence of them mining for limestone. So the limestone was the important resource in these carboniferous deposits. But overlying that in a lot of Fife, you have quite thick beds of sandstone. And what would happen is that sandstone would be removed as overburden, and then that would be used for building stone, and the poorer quality stuff would get used for rubble work, and the stuff that they really liked, which they used to call freestone, and that would be sort of suitable for ashlar work, because it would be quite fine grained, quite hard, there would be a strong cement. They would prefer that for better quality buildings and for the ashlar work. And this is a distribution map of the different stone types that we identified in Inverkeithing. And I'm going to mention the 4 different types of sandstones and tell you a little bit about them, and then show you some examples of stones from nearby quarries to get an idea of where the stone is likely sourced from. So here we have what we have named Sandstone Type Ss1. And we found that this was the most common sandstone used throughout Inverkeithing, and it sort of displays a really wide range of qualities, and it can appear very, very different. And that's all to do with the sedimentary structures and the textures that are within the rock. So this image on the left-hand side here is a thin section image through the sandstone sample, which is on the right-hand side here. And in the thin section sample, what we do is we get the thin sections impregnated with a blue dye. So all those blue areas that you can see are actually pore space, or the lighter blue areas are pore space, clay, that has absorbed some of the blue dye. But the reason we do that is it gives us a really good visual indication of the porosity within these sandstones, and that's such an important factor when you're considering your replacement. And as I said, we did see that this stone sort of had the widest range of decay processes and tended to be in poorer condition, particularly when used on the lower courses of buildings. And that'll have a lot to do with sort of moisture and de-icing salts, as I said. And Sandstone Type 2 was sort of a medium to high quality orange coloured sandstone, very, very typical of Carboniferous sandstones, and very similar in appearance to the Type 1. The thing with this stone is, though, that it did tend to be in slightly better condition, and it tended to only experience bad decay in areas of the stone where there was coarser grains. Now, in the thin section on this one, you will notice all these big black blobs everywhere. Now, what these are iron oxide minerals and clay minerals, which have started to decay. And that decay process is happening just as a result of the rock being at the Earth's atmosphere, being in the building, and coming into contact with atmospheric conditions. But you can see that on the actual hand specimen, I'm not sure whether you can see in the picture, it's got a kind of speckled appearance. So it's pale brown and there's these darker browny orange speckles. It's these black iron oxides that impart that appearance to the rock. But you do see that there can be variations where in some parts of the stone this is not as obvious, and in other parts there's a lot more. And what happens in these regions is, as you can see, where all this black Fe oxides are, there is no pore space, because that is completely filled up, all that blue area and those pore spaces. And then on to building type SSS3, which was from the town hall, and this was actually taken from the bothy floor. So this type of stone, you'll see from the next slide, when it is used outside and it's in an exposed condition, can undergo quite severe weathering. But this one, because it was actually an internal sample that we had taken, the condition of it was relatively good. So we'll have a look at this. So yeah, this one here, you can see this sort of black band that's running through it, and that has given us an indication of bedding in the sandstone. So when you think about when sandstone's getting deposited, there's lots of different methods that can happen, but most of the Carboniferous deposits were due to delta systems. So you had big river systems that were coming in from sort of the western side into this area of Fife, and at this point we were near the equator. So the conditions were a lot different. We had warmer climates and there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. And that meant there was quite a lot of processes where there was periods of sea level rise and sea level fall, and that impacted those delta plains which deposited these sandstones, and that's why they can be so incredibly variable. But this stone is very, very commonly used throughout the Central Belt and further afield, and it quite often gets called a peak rock, and this is just because it has these really fine laminations of iron oxide and carbonaceous matter, which are these opaque minerals. And you can see there is alignment there, and it's not as obvious in the hand specimen, but when you look at it, the microscopic scale, you can really see that there. And because of the type of stone, it was tended to be reserved for use in foundations and rubble works and pavings and things. And it is very similar to this one, which is Sandstone Type 4 that we found. And this would be the second most common stone that was identified. And it seemed to be used in a lot of the less prominent buildings towards the south of the conservation area. And we found as well that a lot of the masonry of this stone type had actually been painted, and it's very likely this is due to the extreme type of weathering that it exhibits. So if you look at this thin section image, you can see there is more of these laminations here. And in the hand specimen image, what you're looking at is the top of that surface. So because these iron oxide minerals dissolve a lot more readily than quartz and the other cementing materials within the rock, you end up getting these sort of laminations, and the decay normally happens in that fashion. And that's called preferential weathering or preferential decay. The softer stuff will get destroyed a lot faster than your harder quartz minerals. And it's quite common, this rock. You see it quite a lot about Fife, and it's very similar to rock from Anstruther and lower limestone formations, which are carboniferous units. And these are the main formations of the geological formations round about Inverkeithing in this part of Fife. On the right hand side is a geological map, and you can see the big green area again, that's your sill complex. And these are all the different faulted different geological units, and they are quite similar, but the reason that they're dated differently and separated is just to do with the slightly different depositional conditions. And the lower limestone formation is just the most important one in the area, and that's what was worked here in Charlestown. The Blackhall limestone occurs within the lower limestone formation. So because you get these marine limestones, they were incredibly important resource for lime mortar and also for agricultural use. That meant these rocks have been very, very widely studied, and a lot of the time they occur with some coal deposits as well, which made the perfect scenario in Charlestown where there was coal and lime nearby. And the other formations, they all have quite similar lithologies, which just means the types of rock that you find, but they're slightly variable and they have slightly different colours and textures. I'm going to show you now some images from the different quarries that we looked at. So what we did was look at the historic resources and also look at the British Geological Survey BritPits database, which tells you all the different sort of quarries from the Central Belt. And what I did was I looked at that and based it on the analysis I'd done of the stone samples we collected to try and then find out what would be the most sort of likely source of these stones. And there's no way to tell 100%, but we know for definite that all these stones would have been sourced very locally. And in this one, there is a sample on the left-hand side, which is from Swinton Quarry, which has actually now been pretty much all land-filled, but you can still access some of the spoil heaps, which is where the sample was taken from. And on the right side is Stone Type S3, and that was the one that was used as a paving stone. But you can see these are very, very similar. These are the same field of view, so you're looking at the same area of each sample. And they look very, very similar and like a good match petrographically. And then the next one we looked at was quite a famous quarry known as Grange Quarry. Grange Quarry is absolutely huge, and it is so variable there. You can find a lot of different sandstones in terms of their appearance, and they're very distinctly mottled and have that speckled appearance with sort of the orange and brown. And that's to do with all these iron oxide minerals you can see. And this was a sample of a type S1 on the right hand side, and you can see they're very similar in terms of your grain size and your grain shape as well. And that is a very important factor. And then moving on to this one is Colalo Quarry. I wanted to do a little bit of a sort of case study. I know I'm going to run out of time really soon, but there's lots of exciting rock stuff. And this one here is from Colalo. So you've got your left hand side from the quarry, and on the right hand is from Stone Type S2. And you can see, looking at those, they do look very similar. I know because no one else here is probably a petrographer, but just in general, when you're looking at these, you can see that they do have quite a similar texture, colour, and distribution of those kind of black patches and the blue space as well. So we went to visit Colalo Quarry to have a look at the different beds. Now, there is a few different phases of Colalo Quarry. There is a lot of old quarries listed that are no longer accessible. This one, we went in to have a look and sampled from different parts of the quarry, just to have a look at the variation in the geology there, because that's something that's really important when you're looking at sandstone. So Colalo Quarry is quite well known for having a very beautiful cream to buff coloured stone, which is usually quite clean in terms that it doesn't have a lot of these iron oxide minerals. But that is not the case with all of it. Some of those beds will not have that perfect appearance. And the stone was considered to be a really good durable stone, but it became too expensive and it wasn't of economic value to continue quarrying that. But these samples here, you can see just on one sample of stone, there is a very distinct variation in the colours and the textures here. And that's something that we always try and reiterate when we're talking about replacement stones and matches. And these are some of the samples that we picked up as well. So we took sort of 3 representative samples from the quarry, and that was to look at just the sort of different variations. So on the left-hand side here, this rock has got these sort of black lines going through it. And these are like those wispy laminations, like that feet rock that was used in the paving stones. And I think that this rock would probably be reserved for rubble and things because of the way it weathers, or it would be used for indoor purposes, indoor masonry, rather than for external use in exposed places, because as we've seen, the buildings that did that, you ended up with a lot of decay. But it was just really this image to show how different these rocks can look, but these are all from the exact same quarry. And I'm going to now move on to mortar quickly and give you a quick summary of what we found there. So Stacey's already talked a little bit about how a lot of the mortar we found seemed to be original and was quite similar in terms of its appearance and texture. So I'm going to have a look at one of the samples which we actually undertook thin section analysis on. So it's the same technique that we use for stones applied to the mortar sample. And this table is just summarising where we took the samples from and what the hydrolicity is, that's your strength, and the colour and the mix ratios. And this is a thin section image. So this is from the Harling, from the boundary wall. And these wavy patterns you can see are actually shell fragments. So something that's really important when you're looking at mortar is understanding, obviously, your mixed proportions, but also what your aggregate, what the texture of that is, what is its composition. And because it had shell fragments in it, and they're of marine origin, you can make a guess that this sand probably came from the mouth of a river or from the beach. And more images here. This one is showing a really, really beautiful shell fragment, and this will be from a type of animal called a bivalve. And here on the right hand side, you can see there's quite a big space here, a big bit of porosity. And this is very common when you're looking at mortars, because especially in a harling, which is on the outside protecting the building, you get a lot of moisture movement traveling through. And when that happens, parts of the binder, which is calcium carbonate, will dissolve and be redistributed elsewhere. And that's an important thing to look at when you're trying to work out how that material is performing in the building. And this is an image of one of the lime inclusions here. Now, the lime that we had here, this was a non-hydraulic to possibly feebly hydraulic lime. And the reason that I know that is by looking at the lime inclusions and looking for something called clinker components. So when you burn a limestone that has impurities, you form silicate, illuminates in the mortar, which sort of imparts the hydraulicity to the material. But all of these clinker components were concentrated within the lime inclusions. And this here in the centre is a lime inclusion where you can see some crackings occurred. All these white patches are quartz, that's some of your aggregate and another shell fragment. But the actual lime inclusion in here only contains a few bits of clinker, which just means that there was some impurity in that limestone. And the sort of summary we have from that is that the lime inclusions, they seem to be acting as a binder rather than as an aggregate. And that just means that they'd kind of diffused with the surrounding binder. And there was no evidence of any additives. So sometimes things like ash are added to a mortar, and that's to make it have a more hydraulic set. And there was no main clinker observed apart from the stuff that was found within the lime inclusions. And the binder was all fully carbonated, and the mortar, the lime inclusions had a really sort of irregular shape to them, and that normally would give the sort of indication that it had been made as a quicklime in a hot mix style. And another thing that indicates that is the presence of things like coal fragments that we found. So another thing we thought to do was to go and sample some aggregate to see if we could get a good match, try and discover if it had come from a local source. And so I went down to the beach at Inverkeithing because there wasn't really a good place to access sort of the mouth of the river. And you can see on these two graphs, the left-hand side is from the beach, and on the right-hand side is from Hill Street boundary wall. And you can see the distribution of the aggregates and the mineralogy of them are pretty similar. So it's of, you know, we're pretty certain that the aggregate would have been sourced locally. And when you're looking at sort of your replacements and your future supplies, and we always say that obviously local resources should be used as far as possible. And if you can sort of source the stone locally, then do so. And Fife is a very good location because we have a lot of really good sands available from quarries such as Lomond and Melville Gates Quarry. And there's another local builders mentioned such as Mason's Mortar as well. And we also have an aggregates database to provide details of sands from over Scotland. And the image on the right hand side is just another image of a mortar sample under the microscope again, and we can provide you specifications and sort of ideas for replicating mixes based on this kind of analysis. And for stone samples, at the moment, there's sadly not very many places in Scotland that are quarrying sandstones, but there is a lot in Northumberland, in north of England, which are very similar deposits. They're all of the same age and the same deposition type as the ones we have in Scotland. And there's some details of the suppliers here. And a lot of these stones are quite similar in appearance when you see them in hand specimen, but it's always a good idea to get samples from the quarry to just see what bed they're working at that time. I think that's probably me for my geology and mortar talk. So I don't know if we're on to a break now, Stacey?
Yes, we are. A short break, I think just 10 minutes. So we're running just a little bit, just 5 minutes behind, so I think we'll reconvene at 5 minutes past 11, and we will take it from there. Okay.
Hi everybody, hope you've had a good break, managed to grab a cup of coffee or something. So this shorter session is to do with repairs and maintenance and how you might organise these types of work packages. And we're going to start off with what not to do, and then what to do and with what materials and when. So we can see here that somebody in their great wisdom has used expanding foam as a repointing, jointing material, totally not acceptable. And again, another example of inappropriate materials which are having a deleterious effect to the masonry units, in this case a sort of pinky reddy sandstone, which as Katie pointed out, you know, water will find the path of least resistance, and in this case the sandstone being weaker than the cement jointing material, accelerating its decay, leaving the cement joints and beds proud. This is what we want to avoid. And this is probably a bit of an extreme case, and it's from a building in Devon, and it's made up of field boulders bound in a clay or earth mortar, and then some bright spark thought it'd be a good idea to cement render it and then not maintain it, and over time the clay binder has been saturated such that it reached its wet plastic limits and then has slumped, leading to the collapse of the wall, and something only fails once. Okay, so here we can see, if we go back to some of the guiding principles of conservation that I mentioned earlier, that you know that your repairs should be distinguishable, but I think this is probably a good example of not quite choosing the right aggregate or binder, and now the repointing scheme that you see sticks out like a sore thumb, and that's something we would want to avoid. And here's just the plain ugly, totally the wrong material, and actually if the person doing this work had read the wall properly, they would have seen remnants of original lime harling and lime wash on the faces of stones, and that's been completely ignored. And I suspect this uses the cement from the Dunbar cement works, Blue Circles works, where the colour of the cement has got darker and darker over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. It's almost sort of navy blue grey colour, so not matching at all. Stacey will go into this a bit more detail, but using impervious gloss paints over natural sandstone in this case has trapped the moisture behind it, resulting in damage to the stone, turning it to a very sandy, friable state. And because most modern film forming paints crack and peel and look tatty very quickly, because the UV rays from the sun are its main deteriorating factor, whereas lime washed finishes will weather and age more gracefully. And you can see in this shot here, inappropriate materials have been used with very little regard to the finish, poor workmanship, and have led to a very poor outcome. And this is a shot of the wall just right next to it. If we were going to repair this, this is what we're going to try and achieve. So it's got a particular texture and colour, the mortar, so that's where our mortar analysis service can come into its own, so we can match mortars much more closely using matching aggregates. And you'll see that the mason has lined out the masonry in line with the coin stones or rybats to make what is very informal rubble infill look slightly smarter than it really is. If we have a look at the top of this roof, you can see it's a natural slate roof, but the repair at the top of the roof has been made with a non-matching natural slate. In this case, it's probably a Welsh slate, laid to very regular courses, and the different colour and the thickness of the slates are different from the originals, and it spoils the character of the roof, which was much thicker slates laid in random diminishing courses. And here we see the offending expanding foam again, and I do hope this is a temporary repair. And it just irks me to see UPVC windows and doors set into a a late Victorian tenement. It just doesn't sit well. And this is actually a shot of my house in Dunfermline, and I think I'm one of 2 houses on my street with original sash and case windows, which, kept in good repair, are very serviceable. And if I had £1 for every time a window replacement company has phoned me saying, how old are your windows? Are they more than 10 years old or 20 years old? And I pipe up, they're in excess of 120 years old. They're absolutely gobsmacked. And well, what can you say about this? I mean, I do hope this is a temporary fix. It certainly isn't a permanent repair. And just a few other examples of attempts to disguise repairs, I suppose, but not very successfully. And this shot just shows, where the inappropriate use of paint coatings and lack of repairs have caused problems of accelerated stone decay. And undertaking inappropriate repairs or not maintaining your building can lead to much more expensive repairs later on, and taken to its logical course, excessive water ingress can cause decay, dampness, or worse, dry rot or wet rot in timbers, making for a very expensive repair in the end. Not maintaining your building or repairing them can seriously reduce the value of your traditional building, making it difficult to sell. Further, you could also threaten the health and safety of a traditional building's occupants and potentially passers-by. So a stitch in time saves 9. The sooner an appropriate repair is made, that prevents a much more expensive repair further down the line. And if we look at this seesaw hypothesis, we can see that a higher initial repair cost can lead to low long-term maintenance costs, and a high long-term maintenance cost can lead to low, a low initial repair cost can lead to high long-term maintenance costs over time. So it's cause and effect. And we've already seen that traditional buildings took a relatively long time to construct, utilising many man-hours in extracting stone, slate, timber, burning limestone to make building lime, and then assembling them as solid wall buildings. And the materials used, as Katie has pointed out, are usually locally sourced and then therefore transported over shorter distances. But these buildings are extremely durable and can last hundreds of years. In comparison, modern buildings have a relatively short construction time, aimed at constructing buildings at a very fast pace. They often utilize manufactured materials or imported materials with high embodied energy. and their designed lifespan tend to not to exceed around 40 to 60 years, with individual systems or components expected to be fully replaced at least once or several times within that period. Replacing elements of a building at short intervals, 10 to 15 years, even at a lower cost each time, is more expensive on average than spending more on durable materials which have longer lifespans in excess of, say, 50 years. So modern construction tends to adopt an almost disposable method of building, in contrast to traditional buildings which outlast most modern buildings by several hundred years. So repairing and maintaining existing traditional buildings uses less energy for materials and is therefore more sustainable. If we have a look at an example of rainwater goods on a building, for example, we've got a typical shopping basket of components, which don't include the cost of installation, by the way, of different rainwater good materials. So we've got cast iron coming in at the most expensive, and PVC the cheapest. But then if we look over 100-year life of a UK home, for cast iron rainwater goods, that would only require one installation cycle, assuming you maintain the rainwater goods, up to 8 installations for PVC, 4 for aluminium, and 1 for copper. So in reality, the costs are over 100-year life of a home. Cast iron comes in not as the most expensive, as it's only installed just once. PVC is more expensive with 8 lots of installation, and interestingly, copper much cheaper. But we don't tend to use copper in the UK for rainwater goods very often. So back to our maintenance and repairs. We need to establish a maintenance program because prevention is always better than cure. For example, clearing out debris out of gutters on a regular basis, particularly after leaves have fallen in the autumn, and prevention can be aided by fitting leaf guards, using appropriate materials for repairs, undertaking regular inspections and cyclical repair strategies. So the watchword should be to try and retain original elements wherever possible. Badly damaged sections from time to time might need to be replaced with new materials, but they should be replaced on a like-for-like basis. So following good practice, good conservation practice and principles, you should also consider practicalities of carrying out repairs. So in general, we've found in Inverkeithing and Cooper, where we've also undertaken a stone and slate survey and a smaller one in Kincardine, that lack of maintenance and repair, particularly of rainwater goods, is prevalent. Stacey's alluded to the large amounts of vegetation growth along roof lines and in rainwater goods. And in particular, this is common to everywhere we look and do surveys, that decaying masonry leading to structural problems, particularly with chimneys, is really very common indeed. Disused chimneys, and almost all of the chimneys we looked at in Inverkeithing were not used for solid fuel fires, means there's a real problem brewing here. They don't get a chance to dry out because they're not used for solid fuel fires. And it's really important that they are vented top and bottom to allow for air circulation. So ideally, disused chimneys should have elephant's feet fitted to the top of them to allow air circulation, and they should be ventilated internally as well. And of course, the limits to our survey in Inverkeithing was that we didn't have access to any of the interiors of any of these buildings to sort of complete the picture. Stacey also alluded to the multiple ownership of properties, and that can add to the problems of organising repairs and ongoing maintenance. But again, a stitch in time saves 9. Don't let your building get to the point where seriously expensive repairs are incurred, when these could have been prevented with ongoing maintenance. And we all know what happens if we don't regularly service our car. So in terms of remedial steps, in order of priority, removal of vegetation growth, any dirt and debris from masonry and rainwater goods is paramount. When you're clearing out gutters, don't allow any of the dirt and debris to enter downpipes, as that might cause blockages. If downpipes are blocked, there's usually an access point along the downpipe to allow for rodding irons to clear out debris. And the vertical sections of downpipes are not sealed and should be able to be parted fairly easily. Sometimes we've found that the placement and size of rainwater goods are inadequate, particularly for the deluges of rain that we've been experiencing in the last 10 years or so. And very often there's very complicated rainwater disposal systems which are shared between adjoining properties and may be inadequate in size. It's not always possible to increase the size of rainwater goods if they're of a particular design, but on more commonly found half-round gutters and downpipes, it should be possible to increase the size and therefore capacity of these rainwater goods to collect and dispose of rainwater, keeping a building dry. You can test for the soundness of cast iron rainwater goods by tapping a section of a downpipe with a metal instrument, and it should ring if it's sound, but if you hear a dull thud, it's probably cracked and will require replacement in cast iron to match. And of course, cast iron rainwater goods require to be painted periodically, ensuring all the rust is removed first. If you have new castings in replacement for cracked downpipes or gutters, for example, they should have 2 coats of a zinc-based primer applied, then a coat of micaceous iron oxide, followed by 2 coats of gloss paint. I mentioned earlier, leaf guards can be fitted to gutters and wire balloons can be placed over the tops of downpipes to help prevent blockages. Back again to masonry decay issues, and you can see here the effects of de-icing salts on this sandstone wall at the base of the walls, not helped by the judicious amount of cement pointing. And usually salts that crystallize on the surface of stone are fairly harmless. They just get washed off or brushed off with rain. But over time they can cause serious problems of masonry decay. And we've just got a few other shots here. I don't know if you can see, but the overhanging cornice on this shot has open perpendicular joints, and the whole point of these overhanging cornices is to provide shelter to the masonry walling beneath. And clearly, if you've got open perpendicular joints, that's going to allow water access to cascade down the face of the wall. And these can be particularly difficult to fully fill because it's difficult for a mason to get a pointing key in to the depth of that wall. And we've actually developed quite a clever grouting system where we use a liquid lime mortar encapsulated by a clay, a modeling clay temporary joint filler, and then we can pour the lime grout into the open joint so it's fully filled. And again, we've got issues. You'll very often see accelerated decay of masonry in line with chimney flues, because most of these chimney flues behind this masonry are not lined, and the sulfur from burning solid fuel, fires, and particularly any cement overpointing that's been applied as a later repair, and uncontrolled access to water can lead to problems of sulfate attack, for example, where the mortar beds and joints expand and can cause masonry decay issues. So ideally, we want to carefully remove any damaging cement pointing or coatings from stone substrates and replace them with more forgiving lime mortars. And where stone is structurally compromised, replacement with a compatible sandstone would be in order. And it may be that your building has been matched as part of the Inverkeithing survey, and that should be available in the public domain on Fife Historic Buildings website. And we can see that we've got new line pointing here next to old, and with a fairly good match. It's not in your face and it's the right material. And we've got issues of, and Stacey showed a very good example of the loss of chimneys and chimney stacks. And here we see an example of a gable end, a gable end that's the chimney actually collapsed partially. It previously had a coating of cement harling over it, as you can see here, which has also come away. And because of the traits of cement, renders and harling are such that they will very often debond from a solid natural sandstone wall, means that water gets trapped behind it. And this has obviously caused the loss of the chimney masonry, which has then been built back up in concrete block and doesn't sit very well as a result. And you should be careful to never use ordinary Portland cement in connection with any flue masonry or below ground works, as the sulfates in ordinary Portland cement can have a deleterious effect on building fabric. So we would encourage you to use natural or formulated hydraulic lime mortars that are weaker than the masonry units. And generally in Inverkeithing, the condition of the slated roofs was actually quite good. There were only a few incidences of slipped or missing slates, which should be replaced on a like-for-like basis as a matter of urgency. The roof being your first line of defence, of course, from wind and rain. So typical traditional Scottish slate roofs, as I mentioned before, are laid with slates in random diminishing courses, which give them a particularly pleasing character when compared to modern tally slating. I'll give you an example here. So here's your random diminishing slate roof using Scottish slate. It has a particular texture and look that's really, once you start looking at roofs, you will appreciate. And if we compare that to Welsh slate that's been laid as tally slating, so that's regular courses, regular slate sizes, I like to think of it as a slating version of Lego, if you like, and doesn't have as much charm as a traditional Scottish slate roof. So ideally, if you can use reclaimed second-hand slates, of course, there's a diminishing supply of second-hand slates, and you would want to try and match the colour, texture, and thickness and size, and have repairs laid by a skilled roofing contractor with a good understanding of traditional Scottish roofing practice. So another good watchword is be vigilant after spells of particularly poor weather. So we had the snow in February, for example. Give your building a once over just to check for any damage. In the last lot of snow, bad snow we had, as it melted at the back of my house, it took away all the burnt sand mastic between the window frame and the masonry of my kitchen window, and it all fell out simply because of the weather event. So be vigilant. If you see broken slates on the pavement or in your garden space next to your home, look up and try and see where the slates have come from. So you should be cleaning out your gutters at least twice a year, and many window cleaners actually offer this service, so you don't have to climb up ladders and undertake the work yourself. You can check your roof from the ground, but if you've got a particularly high building, you might want to use binoculars, or maybe there's an access hatch in your roof. And always attend to any slipped, broken or missing slates as a real priority. So, having looked at your building, you should really try and prioritize the repairs, the most important being emergency works that are required in order to keep your building wind and watertight. Priority 2 would be urgent repairs, which required to be undertaken within the next 12 months in order to prevent further deterioration of your building. Necessary repairs are less urgent matters, which will nevertheless have to be undertaken within the next 2 to 5 years in order to prevent more serious problems. And then priority 4 are desirable repairs that might enhance or improve your building's appearance while safeguarding original features. And so if you've recorded defects and prioritized them in terms of essential repairs and less essential repairs, you can actually put together a maintenance program, and that can provide you a clear indication of what you need to do and the order in which they should be carried out. And it also allows repairs to be broken down into manageable stages and provides property owners with an estimated budget for forthcoming work. So planned building maintenance ensures a suitable timescale is given to repair works and reduces the need for costly, unplanned emergency repairs. And here's a good example of, what repair works and maintenance works are best done at different times of the year. So cleaning the gutters twice a year, so autumn and springtime. Roof repairs ideally in the summer months. Internal painting can actually be carried out at any particular time. External painting, so that's your satin case windows, your rainwater goods and so on, obviously better done in the summer months when you've got less likelihood of rainfall. And your lime mortar work in terms of repointing, harling, rendering are ideally carried out between April and September, but it is possible to use lime mortars 365 days of the year if certain precautions are taken into account. Stacey alluded to this earlier, that many of the buildings in Inverkeithing are tenements and have many occupants, some owners, some not owners, but ideally we would want to try and form a committee and a sink fund to fund your planned maintenance. Alternatively, you might want to appoint a surveying practice to undertake the work on your behalf. These are also sometimes called factors, and get the commitment of the other residents. The new tenement handbook.scot is a good free resource, as is Under One Roof website. And if you're going to materially change the outside appearance of your building, you will require to obtain listed building consent. Applications are free of charge, but do require quite detailed information, and you're probably best consulting an appropriately experienced building professional to submit an application on your behalf. So procuring successful repairs, how are you going to find a reputable company? Word of mouth is pretty good. Recommendations from other people who've had work done. If it's a repointing or a harling or a rendering project, for example, always ask them to carry out a sample panel of finished work for your approval, and then there's no argument as to what quality, colour, texture, finish you're going to get. Always ask for ceiling price, which can't be surpassed, and agree the payment terms up front, and ask for photographic evidence of work carried out to accompany valuations on longer jobs, and enjoy the fruits of your organisational skills and having a weatherproof building that looks good to boot. Okay, that's me, and I'm very pleased to welcome Marcus, who will take us through the quarrier's viewpoint on the extraction of dimensional stone for building repairs, and take it away.
Thanks very much, Ros. Thanks, everybody. I'm a quarryman, obviously, so I'm at the very edge of possibility in terms of getting this this to share, but it looks like I've been successful. Hopefully you can all see that. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so thanks for inviting me along today to speak, you know, from the producer's perspective. We're going to take a very quick look at what suppliers do and things to consider in ordering natural stone. Topics we're briefly going to look at are just the extracting the stone from quarries, bedding planes, sizes of rubble, sizes for masonry, how we cut it up, how we dress it, masonry carving, and looking at surface dressings a little bit as well. How we produce walling, and then we're giving a little bit of thought to the lead times for most stone suppliers, delivery and storage, and what information we need to progress an order. So firstly, we should point out that since the very first moment that anyone anywhere decided to pick up a stone and use it to build, it's always been a tough, heavy, and energy-intensive skilled job. And whilst things developed and mechanized, it did become easier, but still the material dictated the outcome and required great care in its working. Time, you know, moves on, and here shown are a couple of our quarries showing block and walling stone extraction, with the walling material generally found above the cleaner, purer masonry material in most quarries. So just looking at this, you can see here we've drilled and used black powder. So we've drilled about 40 holes along here, and that block is about 2 meters high. It's about 2 to 3 meters deep, and it's about 7 or 8 meters long. That block, when it came out, would have weighed in excess of about 120 tons. And then that's split up into sort of usable 10-ton-ish blocks to go onto primary sawing. And then here down below, this is Swinton Quarry. So you can see that the geology is different here. The block is much lower, much smaller. And here we've got some rubble that we're producing. So we're producing rubble from higher up in the strata here, and then lower down in other areas of the quarry. As we go lower down, we can produce this block. So we go, in order to understand what we're doing now, we just start to look a little bit further back. So going a little further back to simply demonstrate that the principles of digging the block has little changed, as it is largely dictated by the geology that you were digging. Here we see Balloch Quarry in 1921, that's the top picture, demonstrating trenching and wedge splitting. So you can see here, this is the face that they're working down, and you can see this face is all punched. You can see lots of little marks on it. So that has been punched flat in order that they can quarry vertically straight down. And now they've got these beds of stone here, and they are trenching down between the face and these beds of stone so that they've got all the sides open. Excuse me, I've gone back one. Sorry. So they're digging a trench down the side of here, and then if you look closely here, you can see wedges driven across the stones here, because this stone now is what we would refer to as at least two sides open. It's open here and it's open here, but actually they've got it three sides open. So by driving wedges in here, those stones will literally fall out of the ground. And down here, we've got locker brigs in 1937 showing drilling and splitting using black powder explosive to gently split the block along with wedging along the natural beds. And then I think here we've got a close-up of that same locker brigs image. So you can see one by 1937 they were drilling, pneumatic drilling. So one drill mark, and that's then reamed to give the block a chance to show the explosive where to go. So there's one blast has gone down through there, which has created this split, and then they've driven wedges in here and they're splitting the blocks off on their natural beds to make them into usable sizes. So more wedging is shown here at Colalo Quarry in 1937. And also an image of Hales Quarry down here in the bottom corner. That's 1913, splitting out the legendary steps and plats that adorn many properties throughout the central belt and which were available in great size from parts of this famous quarry. So as examples of that, you would think, if you think about, I don't know, a street like say George Street in Edinburgh, you've got the basements at below street level, and then you've got enormous steps and plats that come to the front door that sort of float across from the pavement. And a quarry like Hales, because of its particular geology, would yield these enormous plat stones. And obviously for the tenement buildings as well, the steps that run up through the middle of those, this is the kind of quarry that produced that kind of material. So a further quick glance at Ballochmyle Quarry 1921, showing the incredible scale and working demands. And if you just look, I always love this picture. I just love this tied together in three places ladder. Fancy coming to work every morning and thinking you were going to go down that. Seems pretty crazy, but there you go. But anyway, you can see the extent of the work they were doing. This quarry, the stone is a reasonably soft sandstone. You can see that they were easily able to simply just cut out these massive, massive areas as they were working. And again, this is the same, this is Colalo Quarry in 1937. So showing that same production, that mass production of sedimentary sandstones that occurred for such an important era in Scottish history. This is Course Hill Quarry in 1937, showing them working to natural joints. You can see natural splits in the stone here, and you can see here again naturally splitting stone. So when we drill holes, we're literally just looking at where the natural joints are, and we are joining them up by creating drill lines to make sense of those natural faults. You can also see thinner bedding at the top, which is very common in most sedimentary quarries, which means that rubble stone is often taken from the top beds. And you'll see lots of buildings in your own towns and villages that have random or coursed walling. And often those courses refer to the stone sizes that would literally have fallen out of the ground in these quarries, in your local quarries. And you can also see just an example of some chain sling lifting, which was obviously common in these types of quarries. Okay, and so we quickly move on, and we're just looking at the modern mechanized version of all that we've just seen, showing that whilst mechanization has certainly changed things, still the geology entirely dictates the process of extraction and its suitable uses. So just a couple of examples. This happens to be Darney Quarry, just over the border, which is one of ours, which produces lots of walling products, and that is predominantly out of the top half of this quarry. And then from here down, this is all masonry quality, where you saw that big 130-ton block come out from lower down. So this really, in effect down here, is almost a completely free bedded stone all the way down. So you can pretty much choose any size you want. And you've got a man standing there for scale, just to give you some sense of the kind of scale of that place. Oh, and just up here, we've got underground quarrying. This happens to be Portland Quarry, which is now pretty much all quarried underground, and in there they can use chainsaws to cut the blocks in place, and they're actually just cutting it out from underground. Just nipping back quickly, here shown the other end of Hales Quarry in 1935. Coursed and random walling, curbs and sets literally falling out of the ground here. Ironically, when this photograph was taken by 1937, when a desire to use it was almost for a time at an end. Here at Swinton Quarry, with rubble stone back in vogue by about 1980, I would think. Rubble stone came back into vogue once more. The automated production of the material from the higher beds in the quarry face, whilst the masonry block, as we've said before, from lower down can be seen in the foreground. And we've just got some more images of the same, showing production of suitable products from suitable areas of the quarry strata. So you can just see here the rubble production on these higher beds, but as you work down through, you just start to come to these benched out areas where you can produce the quarry rubble. And this moved on. So that was that quarry. So that's the same place. That digger there would be about there. So this is several years later, and you can see that quarry's developed still further, and you're fully into large scale block production down here. So you're working other beds further along the quarry to still be able to produce the rubble stone. Over here, you can see just the mechanized version of the manual, the machinery driven drilling now. We used to hang on to drills, but we can't do that anymore because our hands fall off, obviously, that's not good. So all drilling now is mechanized. And down here, you can see the kind of scale there. There's a human for scale of that size of quarry. And the kind of working area that we're working to produce the block stone and block for producing the walling. Just a couple of images. So that's a close-up of that machine drilling the holes. And here you can see the result of that. So here you've got very controlled drilling. The more accurately we drill, just think of it as like a jotting notepad when you're able to tear perfectly the top of a jotting pad off because of the little serrated holes at the top. That's exactly what we're doing here. So the closer we do those, this would be referred to as stitch drilling, which gives us very close controlled drilling. And then in this case, we've just used a hammer and wedges, plugs and feathers, just to tap them down. And we're not hitting them hard. We're just gently tapping them, letting each one of them take the strain. And because we're trying to split that block with no stress to it at all, so that when it arrives on the saws, it's not full of cracks through the stresses that we would have caused by trying to tear it out of the ground. And that's just a close-up of, there's the holes that we've drilled at Swinton Quarry. And these are some hydraulic wedges. So we just place them in, and then we can mechanically expand those. They will all expand only about 10 millimeters. That's all is needed to just expand in that hole to be able to control and crack that stone just where we want it to be. Just rolling back just a few years, an example of manual plugging and feathering similar to previous early shots of Hales Quarry. So you can see here, there's the drill holes. there are the plugs and feathers placed in, and there with the hammer that is used to just drive them in. And there's the controlled removal of those blocks. Those blocks are probably in excess of 3 meters long. You know, so you can move a lot with just a little bit of metal and some patience in terms of, you know, if they could build a pyramid, we surely can split a stone still like this, is the principle we're using. Okay, so I quickly want to talk about bedding planes a little bit. So the books will tell you, so just really first to talk about sedimentary sandstones, of which most of the things you will primarily deal with in the Scottish Central Belt in vertical masonry are sedimentary sandstones. So we want to talk just about the orientation of the bedding. When a sedimentary sandstone is laying down in either a desert or a river or a sea, the sediment is laid down in layers as it is washed into the sea or into the river or whatever. It is laid down and then it's compressed over millions of years and becomes a sedimentary stone. So that is my very basic guide to geology over. But nevertheless, it's important when you start to look at your buildings to start to look for telltale signs of the natural bedding. And you can see that even in a weathered stone, you can see how it beds, you can see natural movement or waves in the stone. And so ideally we wish to keep, so as that stone was laid down in this manner with the beds running in this direction, that material is in compression. So the ground is pressing down on it, and such, when it's in your building, the building is pressing down on it. And that's good because it means that when it gets wet and the frost comes, the frost can't expand the beds and blow the stone apart because it is in compression. So this middle one is called naturally bedded. These stones are naturally bedded. This one is called edge bedded because the beds are now standing vertically, but if you were thinking of that stone there as the face of the stone you're looking at the front of your house, you can see that as long as the stones are together, the stones are still held in compression with each other or held together, except where you've got an open edge. And this one over here, and we're now looking at this particular edge here, this is referred to as face bedding. So this is the one we really, really don't like, because when the frost gets to your into your building, into your lintels or your jambs and coins, ribats, the frost suddenly starts to split the front off of your stones, and they literally delaminate from the front backwards. So now when you look at your buildings and you see literally the fronts coming off your stones like pages of a book just falling off, you'll understand that that is because they've been put in face bedded. Now, the reason that builders would have placed them face bedded is because sometimes in geology, they were desperate for height in a geology that produced no height. So they would turn the stone the other way up to get height, or they would turn it up that way because they were trying to do a quick, cheap job. And it's very easy to produce a flat face when you're working parallel to the beds. So they might have been doing it to cheat, or they might have been doing it to try and get extra height in the stones. But either way, your stones want to be in your vertical wall, generally naturally bedded. The books will tell you that, for instance, for a mullion, which is the stone that runs in the center of a window. So you've got two sash and case windows, and you've got one long thin stone in the middle, which usually are sort of 6 or 7 feet in length. They will tell you that they should be naturally bedded as well. And I can tell you pretty much that I doubt that there's a building in the whole of Scotland with a naturally bedded mullion. And that's because stones tend not to fall out of the ground at 7 feet high. And even if they did, if you picked them up, if two of you got hold of one and picked it up, it would fall in half because its weakest dimension would be at peril. So most of the time, mullions are edge bedded. Occasionally they're face bedded. But in those occasions where a stone is vulnerable on an open edge, you should be wishing to use what we would refer to as a free stone. And a free stone is a stone where the natural bedding is not clear. So the stone is tight enough that the natural bedding, its weakest element, which is where the bedding runs, is not available in that stone. So where you've got, say, cornice stones, which are vulnerable to attack, where you've got mullion stones, or cope stones, anything like that, you should always be trying to use a stone that you would refer to as a free stone. And I just remind you, that means that the bedding, which is the weakest element in any stone, is not visible, is not clear. So it means that in fact the stone is equally weak or equally strong in all three dimensions. Whereas with a very bedded stone, it's much, much weaker in one dimension. Hope I've kind of made that clear. Okay, so rubble sizes, just a note here, pre-1919 houses, generally the walls are 2'6" thick or thicker. If there's a castle, it could be 7 feet thick. Whereas modern buildings, the front facade is perhaps only 100 millimeters or 4 inches thick, and at best 150 millimeters or 6 inches thick. So what that means is that whilst we desire buildings to look like the scale of pre-1919 buildings, it's not always easy to achieve the scale of the stones of those old buildings, because if you're splitting stones at 100 mil thick or 4 inches thick, it's very difficult to get them to split accurately at that thickness when the stone sizes are very big. So you might have a building that is all the stones 12 inches thick, and you think it's quite a simple job to get some guillotine stone all 12 inches thick. It might be that you have to change your expectation or ask the producer to perhaps cut the backs off it or hew the fronts down to be able to achieve the scale for your pre-1919 building. And bear in mind that, just as we said earlier, that pre-1919, it fell out of the ground generally to suit a 2'6" wall. And a 2'6" wall wasn't an accident. Or let's talk about a field wall in a farmer's field, tends to be about 18 inches thick. And that's because most stone will generally fall out of the ground between 8 to 10 inches thick. So when you look at walls, be looking to understand how little work the masons were doing when they were trying to do the work, if you understand. And that was based on the geology. So remember that historical masonry buildings often reflected the most economical sizes available from their local geology and their stone sources. As an example here, this is Greenlaw Town Hall. That building is of Swinton sandstone. These pillar courses here are etched on my soul. They are about 950 millimeters high, those courses, each course is as a maximum. And wouldn't you know it, when we quarried Swinton Quarry for the last 20 something years, we've never found anything that's come out of there higher than a meter. So often the architecture that certainly in the older buildings is limited to what they were digging. So we just quickly how we saw it. The economical cutting and selection of block is key to cost of the finished product. So really all I'm pointing out here is that we're never trying to cut up a long slab to produce short blocks. We're always trying to use the blocks that we have to maximize the use of them. So we're using small blocks for small stones and big blocks for big ones to make it as economic as we can. Just touching on how we saw it, here you can see this is a monoblade saw. This is like a large hacksaw, and that block will be about 2 meters high. So that table can take up to about 15 tons, and that will be a single or multi blades that just slowly chew down through that stone, cutting at about a rate of 1 meter an hour. Here you can see this is a 2 meter blade, so we will have saws that are 3 meters or 2 meters. And this process that these two saws are carrying out is called primary sawing. And that is basically, think of an uncut loaf of bread, and then think of it as a cut loaf, a sliced loaf of bread. We are literally slicing up the stone to make slabs. And generally that's bespoke to order, because if you look at the buildings that you'll be looking at and restoring, all of your coins and jambs and walling and other things, they'll all be different heights and sizes. So we will be taking job sheets and we will be cutting slab to order. And then once we've got that slab, that's another example of that 2 meter saw cutting that. But then once we've got the slab, we turn the slab over. So now that slab is laying on its back. So we've got 2 parallel sides, and then with smaller blade saws, that's a 1200 or a 4-foot blade. We sit them on turntables, and then we cut the other 4-dimension sides to give us the sawn 6 sides dimensions of your finished piece of masonry. So talking about the masoning and dressing of the sawn material is done by a mixture of machine and by hand. And attention to detail is everything within this process. Milling, routing, CNC profiling all have their place in the modern production facility and in keeping the UK stone able to compete with imported products, while some aspects need to be finished by hand. So here you can see just an example of some milling and routing going on, some profiling with diamond milling machines. But when it comes to turning that profile into a return, internal return or an external return, those things have to be done by hand. So it's a mixture of both of those things are required in our process. And then just talking about hand dressing, different patterns have developed all from a starting point of cheaply hewing a stone to make it flat or provide a good key for the application of lime render. At a certain historical point, these rougher finishes became more refined and decorative aspects in their own right. Ask yourself, what was the mason trying to do here? What is the chisel width? What is the orientation of the marking and spacing? All should be noted in matching the existing. So here are some very traditional Scottish and Borders and Northumbrian stone finishes. You can just see on the edge here just a bit of a tooled margin. On the corners of most of your dressed stones, you'll see a 2-inch wide tooled margin, and that is so that the arris, the corner, the clean corner, is protected. And then the cheaper finish in this at this point here, so this cheaper, rougher hewn finish is then dressed up to that 2-inch point. So this is a broached finish, which looks like a comb dragged across it, but that's done with a single point. And if you were in, say, a 17th century building, that would be probably 1 inch apart and would be very coarse. Whereas by the time you get to a 19th century building, that would be very, very fine and a very decorative finish. And the same with this, the same with all of these finishes. So that is some horizontal stugging or punching. This is some diagonal. It could be vertical. A left-handed mason and a right-handed mason will go in opposite directions. So you can see whether a stone has been hewn by a left-handed mason or a right-handed mason if you just begin to look and see. Most of your rubble work will be all directions, whichever one was quickest to get the face flat. Here's some sparrow pecking here, and here's some very fine 2-inch droving. But in each case, you can see how the chisel was applied to the job. And if you're going to spend some money replacing stone on your job, the tooled finish really matters, because it's the difference between making it look fabulous as a finished product or pointless as a poor project. Okay, just a little note, cavity wall in production. So this is the splitting process. So you can see slabs come in on the conveyors and they run through a basic hydraulic splitting machine to split at either 100 millimeters or 150 millimeters or thicker if your job needs it. And then the stone is all dressed and squared up by hand, giving you a nice clean squared face. This is just some squared split face rubble walling. Happens to be buff, but can be in any color. And the results of that type of work results in pleasing new builds, and you can see some accurate restoration work done down here as well. Okay, now we're just quickly going to go through the ways to do a clear material takeoff. So there are various ways depending on the complexity of a job. Obviously, if it's a massive major building, well, every stone is drawn and detail is put onto a drawing and stones are numbered up and marked as to what should be replaced. Another simpler way of doing that is to simply take photographs of stones and then mark up the photographs and then place sizes on those and do drawings from those. And then if it's an easier job than that, often you can reach from the ground or with a cherry picker and you can measure up. But bearing in mind, as we've explained the process of primary and secondary sawing, if you can tell us the slab sizes, so perhaps you might know what the bed width, the front to back dimension is of your stone, and you could say, well, I think I need 20 square meters of stone at that dimension. The slab could be produced at that point before the scaffold goes up. And then when the scaffold goes up and or for cherry picker, you're able to get the length and the height of those stones, the sawing yard can already be part way through that process, which saves you a lot of cost in terms of scaffold. So the process in the production works has many aspects. So early indication of basic sizes helps, as slabbing can be done early, ready for hard dimensions. And you can just see there's the cut slab. Then we cut it, we dress it, or it is polished and it goes for delivery. There are numerous ways that this has to go through a production facility. And all of those things take time, but we can mitigate against those if we get early information. So earnest production cannot start until the 3 dimensions of each stone is concluded, and thereafter any accurate templating is completed. The early planning of this saves much scaffold cost if it can be achieved. And also just to bear in mind that to agree with your contractor the profile of any molding is quite an important thing, because often in old buildings, the molding is so destroyed. If you put in some really new version of that, it will stick out against some of the more worn material. So it may be that you want to do that, or it may be that you want it closer to a more worn in version. And I think that's a discussion that needs to be had on site with your team. Okay, this is a bit of an odd one, but site space and schedule of component cool-off must be considered. so your available space does not get filled with material you cannot initially use. You know, often site space is very limited, and if you are clear in the first place about the items you need first, then those pallets can be delivered and you can start your process, and there's a clear understanding for your production yard what needs to come when. And we have had sites where the opposite has happened, and they've ended up with a site full of stone that they can't actually build, and they can't fit the stuff that they need onto site. Packing of high value projects is important, and consideration of site storage and handling must be carefully planned. And we just really are saying there, you know, natural stone is an expensive thing, and sometimes we see on sites material is thrown around or left on scaffolds unprotected, and then it's damaged, and to have gone to all the expense of paying for it and getting it there, it seems a shame not to take care of it in that last part. So just a few slides really to reflect on that quick whistle top tour through all of that. Be comfortable, know and understand the supply quarry. You should feel able to contact quarries and suppliers, and feel able to go and visit them. I think that they're pleased to see people. I think they're pleased to see people who are interested in understanding the product, so that you get what you need and we understand what it is that you want and your expectation. So be confident about the fact that the quarries are happy to see you. And the same goes for the masonry yard, because they're not always the same thing. There are many, many good masonry yards in and around Scotland, and you may be using one of those. They don't necessarily have the quarries, but they have access to quarries. And so get to know your masonry yard. And again, I wouldn't be shy of going and having a look around and understanding what it is that they're capable of doing and how they do it. Ensure the information on stone type, which places like the Lime Centre can help you very much with. So ensure that the information on stone type and detail is provided in good time to promote the best lead times possible, so that you get what you want when you need it and it all fits just right. And there's a few examples there. That's McEwen Hall in Edinburgh. Some of the cornerstones for that job, there was one piece of cornice that was 7 tons, just one piece. Just incredible pieces of masonry, and you know, the time it takes to plan and organize a job like that is immense. But still, for some cornice on a nice building along your high street, still there's time is required for that. So that's it. I don't know how that was for time, but thanks very much for listening. I hope that's been helpful for you.
Thanks, Marcus. Yes, we are running a little bit behind schedule, but I'll try and make some of that up. Marcus, are you sticking around for some questions later? Just put a couple in the chat, or shall I ask them to you now?
Yeah, ask them to me now if you could. I've got another meeting I've got to go to, if that's possible.
No worries. There was one question about basically supply chains across the UK, and the current, well, the last year of the pandemic and Brexit. Is there any ambition or renewed energy in Scotland across the sector from local or national government and practitioners to reopen any quarries at a small scale to serve Scottish or the wider UK market?
Well, I would say that the quarries that are currently established in Scotland and nearby are all running well. They're all running, you know, they're all still putting out. So there is broadly a blend of the required sedimentary sandstones that you would require for most of the central belt stuff. I don't think there is any drive from government or from planners for mineral extraction, but I think that those of us in the industry are always looking for other possibilities. But yeah, I mean, you know, to open a sedimentary sandstone quarry costs you at least 250,000 quid to even get in the door, and most of the time, you know, the planners are saying, well, what else are you going to do for the community? And at that point, given that you are only basing it on the historic knowledge of a material and your own gut feeling, it's a bit difficult to be saying what else you can do for the community other than and do your very best to quarry it. I think that the producers that have survived, all of the producers have currently survived the current difficulties of the last years. I would reflect actually that business in general has had a torrid 5 to 7 years of, this is a contentious word, but referendum, Brexit, COVID, and then the nightmarish outcome of Brexit now. I know many firms that have got lots of things, machinery and plant, stuck in customs ports. We've had machinery now stuck for 4 weeks in the customs that we can't get through for a major repair on a line for us, and it's just stuck there. And that's a real strain on business. And I think that regardless of, you know, like I used the word referendum in there, regardless of however you see an independence referendum going, I think business has had a real pasting over the last 5 to 7 years in terms of all of those things. And I think COVID and the mess that is Brexit that we're coming out of, I think they are just about tiring businesses out. And I don't think that we are desperately trying to think big at this moment. I think we're trying to consolidate and continue to produce high quality as best we can with what we've got. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, totally understand. And just a quick one. Now the quarries aren't allowed to be used for landfill once worked out, is how will land be remediated?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You look at any quarry that, I mean, as we finish quarries off, as we go through phases of quarries in the UK, there is restoration plans. We have to have a restoration plan in place. So that is a natural form of restoration, and like, you know, leaving tidy. But in actual fact, by some careful planting, natural habitat returns very quickly to those places. And, you know, they just become places that wildlife re-inhabits very quickly. So, I mean, you know, not a bad story, really.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marcus, for joining us, and I'll let you go. I've got one more presentation, and so does Emma. So
thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. So I will now speak a little bit about paint removal, and I will try and keep it as brief as I can to get back on track. So this picture, again, I like to start with pictures because it tells a lot more than just words. It's a little bit of a scary picture, black paint with this little hole in the middle, but it kind of sets the scene for paint removal. So there is damage. We can see there's damage. There's a hole in the paint finish. And you can see it's been painted over many, many times. There's a lot of coats and layers, and actually the black paint is the most recent of the coatings. The original or the older layers of the paint was a more white color. And actually you can see, or possibly see, that the original lime wash is still on the stone and is actually more of a golden color, which is quite in keeping with the natural lime in this area. If it was more of a sort of like the Charlestown lime that's found, it does burn to a nice golden color. And this particular building is the half crown. Formerly, no, sorry, this is actually the Borough Arms, the pub next to the half crown. And this evidence of lime washing is good for justification for redecoration, and we'll come onto that in a little bit. But if we left it unrefurbished, and we've just left this to be, what is happening is all the water that hits the face of the wall is concentrating in that little hole, and it's concentrating all the water into the stone, which is porous, and it's sucking it up, but it's not really allowing it to dry out. And so what that results in is a constant washing, constant saturation of the stone, and the stone goes through a lot of washing and salt crystallization, and basically what ends up is the face of the stone basically disintegrates. So just to go to the fundamentals of when we're talking about modern paints, they usually, well, quite crudely refer to the method of curing, so how they form. When we talk about film forming paints, that is generally what we refer to when we're talking about modern paints, modern masonry paints. And this is because when they cure or dry, modern paints dry to a solid film, which is impervious to water usually, and water vapor. However, lime wash, which is basically a suspension of lime, dries or cures much like a lime mortar. And so it's porous, it has a similar mineral makeup and pore function as the substrate it's being applied onto, so the lime and the stone that it's being applied onto. Modern mineral and silicate paints mimic that slightly, in that they also cure or dry similarly to lime washes, lime paints as well. It's just that they have various additives in them which make them a little bit more robust, more water repellent, and also aid pigmentation. So while paint technology has progressed to allow more UV resistant paints, older masonry paints are susceptible to UV degradation. As you can see in this picture, there's quite a lot of flaking, and it's become brittle and cracked over time. And again, this will be allowing a lot of water in, but generally not really allowing a lot of water evaporation, so not allowing the stone to dry back out again. And you can see it's not only perished on the stone, but it's actually perished on the stone, on the timber pilaster as well. So it is likely all decorative coatings will require a topping up or completely renewing, especially when adjacent to a busy pavement or roads, because of the frequent wetting and salt attack. However, film forming paints make it much more difficult because of the way they completely seal the stone. Lime washes are much easily coated over because of the porous nature of the material. This does mean that it is more that lime washes and lime paints and that those sorts of finishes do require more maintenance, but that's why there are more options available to us now which help us overcome those issues. So step one, you've identified there are some issues and they require remedy. Step two is the removal. You can't just paint over masonry paint with anything other than itself, basically. And this decision, if you did decide to just paint over with masonry paint, you would just be getting back into a vicious cycle. So to remove the paint fully is the only way to go to actually get back to a traditional finish. There are several techniques available to remove paint, and it is sometimes unique to the type of paint, thickness of paint, and the substrate. For this reason, trials of several techniques and pre-treatments should be trialed to ascertain which is the best and most effective technique, which uses the least abrasive method and the least amount of water. Often overcleaning nowadays actually relates to oversaturation of the stone itself, not just removal of the face of the stone via abrasive techniques, because oversaturation brings salts to the surface of the stone, and that can cause deterioration and salt damage and blowing off the face of the stone over time. So basically, this is a list of removal techniques, starting with the least abrasive or the least intensive, which is basically manual scrubbing with a wire brush to ascertain how difficult the paint is to remove. One up from that is low pressure water, and then high pressure if the paint still persists. I would say that that technique is not very effective, and it can lead to oversaturation of the stone. Even though it's low abrasive, you can then end up damaging the stone or staining the stone long term. The DOF, or the superheated steam removal technique, is the most common and is actually probably the most effective when used with a pre-treatment. Moving on from that, then nail guns and brush pads attached to drills is more for persistent areas, small areas that are difficult to remove. The last kind of step is where, say, you've got a cement wash or liner stone or something like that, where you might use a system such as torque, which has a fine particulate in it. So it's not really sandblasting, but it has got an aggregate, a very, very fine particulate in it, which helps to, again, be more effective so that you've got less contact time with the actual cleaner. A note about needle guns and drill brush pads is they do have a limit on the time that you can work with them because of vibrational data. So you can only really use that for very, very limited amounts of time. And again, that kind of slows down the project. So you kind of want to use that sparingly. I'm just going to try and share something else with you. There's just a couple of videos, and I'm just going to try and do this because who knows, it might not even work. And these are not, I'm in no way endorsing any contractors or anything like that. I'm just purely using some of these videos as an example. So I'm hoping you can see this. This is a demonstration of the DOF, or actually a Thermatech, which is an alternative to DOF made by Stone Health. A superheated steam pressurized cleaner, and it is removing the paint easily off some stonework, that's red sandstone. And I would likely say that this has been pre-treated with a paint softener. Now, if we look at this example, again, I'm in no way endorsing or trying to slag anyone off. If we look at the one proximity to the actual substance, it's pretty close. Paint is not becoming all whatsoever. I would say this paint has not been pre-treated, and operative is just merely kind of whacking away with bond, and there's probably some damage to the mortar and possibly the brick face itself. Not really the most efficient way to remove paint. And if we go again, this one is just really showing the actual effects of what can happen and what could be lying beneath a painted surface that appears to be quite, you know, fine, okay, robust, but actually what is happening is the paint is actually holding the stone together. And what lies beneath is just sand, because the stone has totally disintegrated from a constant saturated state. So that little horror story is over, and I will just go back to my PowerPoint. So looking at those little demonstrations, you can see that oversaturation is quite a risk, particularly when you are not using the technique properly, and the operative isn't maybe not trained adequately. And what that leads to then is something similar to what was shown in the picture, the video with the stones turning to sand. That can quite easily happen to stone that's been oversaturated and over cleaned. Abrasive techniques obviously etch into the stone itself. You can remove some of the details, dull down carvings, that sort of thing. And that's what you don't want to do. You don't want to dull down details or remove tooling. Certain chemicals, if they are used as a pre-treatment, if they're not the right ones, can also lead to staining. And if the stone is not treated properly, i.e. pre-wetted so that the suction is controlled, the chemicals can penetrate and then also cause some damage. And then other techniques such as the torque comes with its own health and safety risks, just because of the silica particulates that are used as the aggregate. So when we are looking at a paint removal scheme, you really want to do it very carefully and by all follow the manufacturer's guidelines. That is from the pre-treatments to the actual paint, the remover itself. So whatever you're using, a steam cleaner or whatever it is that you're using. Always treat the surface of the stone. Try and not let anything penetrate too deeply into the stone, and that is the same for water itself. So try and avoid oversaturation. Try and use skilled operatives and a skilled contractor who knows what, who has experience in conservation projects and stonework. Always use trials, because that gauges efficacy and cleaning times to better gauge what techniques are the best ones to use, and allow enough time in the program for that, but also for the full removal, so that you're not rushing things and trying to get things all faster than it needs to be. And consult with building professionals that know and have experience with paint removal and pre-treatments and that sort of thing. This is an example of not necessarily paint removal techniques, but this was probably a cement render that was removed. And what was left was lots and lots and lots of scutch chisel marks. As Marcus was just mentioning, this can be a finish of stone, but it is not one that was found in Inverkeithing. So this tooling method is not one that was probably original to that building. It was probably either left polished because it's ashlar, or at the very least it would have been stucked because that was the tooling marks found in Inverkeithing. This is an alteration of the surface finish, and that's again something we want to avoid. Not that it really helped, because this paint finish is still not stuck on. And again, this kind of just reinforces where it's close to a pavement, paint finishes will always suffer much more than those, midway through a wall. So we have decided we want to take it off, and we've taken it off successfully. Now we want to put something back. As we have seen, there's evidence of a previous finish if it's any one of those buildings that we found, and we have to take that into account when we're choosing a suitable replacement finish. This may be color matching the original lime wash if anything is found, or the original lime harling, and using that as a basis for the color. Now, when we are thinking of a material, we want to think about the location and the detailing. So like I said, is there a road? Is there a pavement? Is there lots of splashback and salt? Is it highly exposed, such as a gable end or a chimney? These areas, excuse me, we might treat differently because they are more exposed. And and then we would maybe suggest possibly using a modern material such as a silicate paint or a lime paint, which has additives in it to help the finish last longer. Not necessarily for the whole building, but it's something that we use for certain areas to help prevent some of these early defects. They don't hinder vapor permeability, these modern materials, but they do reduce it slightly, but because they repel water, and that also then kind of avoids oversaturation. As we saw in that one video, sometimes what lies beneath is not that great, and it is sometimes a surprise. So sometimes stone replacement is actually required where it was not known before. An assessment of the stone should be made following paint removal, so that if there are any major flaws in the stonework, that it can be assessed and treated. These principles that I have discussed are also applicable to rendered finishes. So do we need to remove it? Is it damaged? Do we need to intervene? How do we remove it? Carefully, and by means that cause the least damage to stone. What do we put back? Is there evidence of a previous lime hull? Or do we use what we've learned in this survey and our analyses of lime hulls in the local area? Do we need to alter the specification for detailing, such as chimneys or gable ends? Because these areas need more protection. And remember, out of all of this, hulling can cover a multitude of sins. So in the event that once a painted finish is removed, sometimes a hull finish can help protect it and cover up possible, like we saw earlier, brick infill and that sort of thing. And we can think of this both when we're uncovering masonry from a cement render, and also when we're putting it back on. Lime hulls are the warm blanket that some buildings need to protect them. And I will finish on this, which is the view from the bottom of the Friary Gardens, which was where Ros and I went for a little respite on one of our last Inverkeithing jaunts. And I have to say, this survey was not filled with summer strawberries and double square sausage rolls like our Cooper survey was, but it was still special, and we uncovered some real gems, and so we really did enjoy it. So I'll leave you with that parting little memory. And now to really wrap things up, Emma will speak to you a bit more about the grant scheme.
Hi everybody, can you see the screen okay? I just wanted to thank our speakers. We're so fortunate to have the Scottish Lime Centre Trust so close to us. What amazing expertise and talent and passion and knowledge we have. And we hope, I feel today has already demonstrated, we hope that the Stone and Slate survey will benefit a wide range of people, from homeowners who want to understand the repair needs of their building, to contractors, architects, surveyors, other building professionals looking for technical information, and for Fife Council planning staff dealing with consent applications. The full report will soon be free to access on the Inverkeithing Heritage Regeneration webpage. That's the link there. It's not there yet, but you will find it. It's big, it's really big. They've worked so hard, they've done so much. So you'll find a lot of the appendices there as well, which amazingly include detailed stone and mortar analysis results, maps mentioned in the report, some generic specifications, and some general guidance for lime work. If you would like a copy of the individual survey sheet for your building, feel free to call or send an email using the email address that you see on the screen there. And we also have some high-level photos taken by a drone camera for many of the buildings in the high street, which gives you a view that you wouldn't be able to see from the street. And I'd just like to finish with 3 examples of how useful this survey has already been and how it has benefited Inverkeithing. The townhouse design team have been able to use the survey findings to specify the replacement stone that will be used in that restoration project. Our 5 council colleagues working on the High Street public realm renewals have been able to use the information to create a detailed specification for their new paving stone slabs and identifying locally quarried stone if possible. And finally, property owners who are at an early stage of thinking about arranging their building repair grant scheme have been able to get an overview of the type of repairs that their building needs, really clearly and helpfully specified, which can help them begin a conversation with a contractor, an architect or a surveyor. But I'm now going to stop sharing, hand back to Stacey. I think there are some amazing questions, so I'll let Stacey handle those for you.
Yes, well, if anybody has got some extra questions, by all means, unmute yourself and ask away. I think I've answered some and Ros has answered some in the chat as we've gone along. But yes, by all means, ask away if there's any questions.
Could I ask one? I know that the public realm works are going to involve new paving. They're going to take up some asphalt and tarmac and replace with stone paving, which will be lovely, as well as some new street furniture and conserve and move the Market Cross. But given that we saw lots of gritting salt damage to lower courses of building stones, how does that play out? Could some of your great heads give me an idea of what happens with building with stone used at ground level?
I don't know if you want to answer this one, Katie.
Yeah, so for the public realm works, it was Scotch buff sandstone that was recommended for the paving. And the reason for that is it's one of the stones that sort of sits in the kind of moderate part of the spectrum when it comes to salt decay and things. So it's not one of the stones that is very prone to the ice and salt problems. So it's one that is very durable and recommended for paving. So
good.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, thank you.
So any more questions?
May I ask a question?
Yep.
Yeah, very informative presentations this morning, a lot of information to take on board. Is there some way that the various slides, which had a lot of text on them, be made available that we can download, as it were? Yes,
I think following this session, both the recording of this of the Zoom will be made available via a link, and then I think also the presentations will be emailable. Well, don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure if you email in and ask after, but I think there will be an email following this, which will ask if anybody wants it, then it could be emailed to them.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Could I just add to that as part of our program, we plan to offer lots of training. So if there is an additional or a follow-up or something that you would really like to see us put together that would be useful to you, you think colleagues of yours might want to see, please email that email address you saw before, or email the Line Centre, and we will do our best to put together a program that meets a need. We're really fortunate to have this funding and this amazing opportunity, but Inverkeithing's problems are not unique, and it's really all about doing the right thing by our buildings. And if there's training that would help you do that, we would be very, very happy to help arrange it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm a building surveyor from South Wales, and yeah, I found today very informative and very interesting. But I've got a general question, which might be a presentation all on its own, really. But Cadw and English Heritage are really poo-pooing hydraulic limes at the moment, and there's a general push towards hot limes.
Yes.
I wondered what your thoughts were, really.
Well, I
think
our stance has always been there's a place for all mortars, and sometimes hot mixed mortars are appropriate, and sometimes hydraulic lime mortars are appropriate. So I don't think you can play one off against the other. I do think there's a lot of misinformation about natural hydraulic limes and hydraulic limes. And I think we have shown in Scotland, certainly in my time at the Lime Centre, that gauged hot mixed mortars gauged with hydraulic lime have been used very successfully. And that was banned by English Heritage at some point in time because they had a massive failure. And that was down to workmanship or poor specification. So I think it's a whole host of things, and one isn't better than the other. And I think I'm probably like a broken record saying there is a place for all mortars.
I kind of tend to agree with you, really. It's just that on a recent project where hydraulic lime has failed, well, the mortar hasn't failed, but the problem with the damp penetration through the gable of the building has continued. My next step, although it was not original to the building, but it is vernacular style, is to slate hang the gable in order to prevent the penetration of the moisture, which it was in a chapel, and it was soaking through the treads of the stairs that were against the wall. So the proposal was to slate hang it, but Cardiff were providing some grant towards it and refused to allow us to go that far unless we tried hot liming it first, and they were convinced that by hot lime mortar pointing instead of the hydraulic lime mortar pointing would cure the problem. You know, I'm not convinced myself.
I think a little information is dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's why we look at buildings holistically. We don't just home in on the lime. You know, we look at how the building detailing and the materials are working or not working in the case of your project.
And that's where I was coming from as well, really. You know.
Yeah.
But,
well, that's the sensible approach. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
There's one question here, probably for you, Ros. What additives extend the life of lime wash, or is it better to accept the repeated applications will be needed from time to time?
Well, I think it's a misnomer that lime wash isn't very durable. I mean, it depends where it is, like where your building is, what element of the building it's on. I mean, there's historic precedent in using tallow lime wash, so that has the addition of an animal fat to afford the lime wash water repelling properties, and that has a long history of use. The use of casein, which is a milk protein, can also make lime washes slightly more durable than just plain lime wash. But it also depends on how well the lime wash was applied in the first place in terms of its longevity. So I think there's lots of things at play there, and good maintenance of the building, as always.
And more modern additives, there is things called UniProtect, which you can add. Which again basically is just a water repellent, and it does aid slightly the pigmentation, so you need less coats, which is essentially just then producing a lime paint, which we have used on the workshops before, and it has done a pretty good job. And I don't know if you can tell really the difference between the lime painted elevations and the lime washed elevations, other than they look a little bit brighter, but they do then cut the number of coats. We only needed 2 coats, whereas I think if we were doing it with lime wash, probably would need about 4 or 5. So that's another advantage. Anybody else for any other questions? think it's probably coming up to lunchtime.
I got one more maybe.
Yeah.
There seems to be an increase in products using graphene as an additive. I wonder if you've got any experience or comments on use of graphene in lime paints and lime washes.
I
I'm afraid I haven't come across that myself, Carl.
It's probably best you Google it than I try and explain, but it's used in, they use it in an additive in rubber for tires to increase longevity. There's a couple of firms using it in lime-based paints to increase durability. It's a carbon, it's a very, very thin slice of carbon molecules, I think, in some form or another, you know. Okay, well,
we'd certainly like to trial that. So we'll follow that up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. Just a quick comment on that stuff. Ros, I'm aware of the tallow being used in the lime. Has lanolin ever been used? Because lanolin is also another animal product, and we use it on the Thames barges, for instance, on anything that's going to come into contact with wood as a lubricant, because you can't use grease, because grease actually rots wood.
That's interesting, Phil. No, I haven't seen any accounts of lanolin being used in lime wash that I can think of. And obviously that, you know, lanolin is used in soap making and so on as well. I don't know how you would disperse it. So if you make tallow lime wash, you have to make the lime wash from quicklime. So it melts the solid fat and it emulsifies. So it never
probably
reforms.
Be similar for lanolin, I would think. Okay. Yeah, it was a lovely talk, folks. Really good. Just on the stone subject, has anyone come across gritstone or millstone grit? I'll tell you, we found it, the big parapet coping stones to the Martello Towers, certainly some of those on the east coast, I haven't checked out the south coast, are constructed with it. And it's very good at resisting impact damage. Hence it was used on the parapets of the Martellos that were going to be bombarded. Now I wonder if you'd come across it on your castle parapets or anything like that.
Probably on fortifications, coastal ones. I mean, things like lighthouses, granite was used very often.
Yeah.
As a hard, robust stone. Well,
of course, gritstone is a sandstone, and it's but it's very open. But I've got a lovely report on it because they didn't realise it. In fact, one idiot had actually said he thought it was granite. I thought, well, look at it, that's never granite in a million years. And I took it to a stonemason who I knew I could trust, who immediately identified it as Lancashire grit. But that's not the correct term. The correct term is millstone grit in geology terms. And I've got a lovely report on it, which I'll pop across to you. It's only a short thing, about 3 pages, but very well.
Bill, you never send me anything that's short.
This is very short. No, this is very short. I must tell you, the meeting house is looking fantastic.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
I will give you some finished pictures. That lime wash and the lime finishes there are absolutely fantastic.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any more questions?
No, a little comment on paints. I'm an architect from Germany, and thank you for this interesting performance. And in Germany, for historic buildings, we are used a little paint from southern Germany. It's from the Keim company. It's K-A-I-M. You must know it.
Yeah.
And we have a great experience with that, and this is a very good protection. I have used it since 40 years from the beginning of my career, and I'm from Bremen, and the historic body in Bremen used this for all historic buildings. They have it colorless for protecting natural stone. Sandstone is the most used stone in Bremen. And for rendering buildings, they used some pigmented stuff of that. So, and I think they have a abundance here in Britain as well, but less used, I think.
I think we have quite a lot of it in Scotland, because our exposure in Scotland is a lot higher than the rest of the UK. Well, a lot of the rest of the UK, but Wales, probably Cumbria, and some other areas in England that have a higher wind-driven rain index. But Scotland is particularly exposed, and it's particularly wind-driven rain is our problem. So we tend to use lime paints or silicate paints like Kime more than any other of the areas in the UK. And again, there's a long history of using Kime quite successfully. We also use another brand called Beak, which is very similar principles. Again, a silicate paint, basically the same product. And they tend to weather quite well and really only need one sort of top-up coat. And they keep the stone pretty well protected, with not really very many issues with vapor permeability or anything like that. And usually in these talks, we sometimes ask Tony Carter, who is the Scottish representative for Kime, to do a talk. But there just wasn't enough time to fit everything in. So we didn't have him, but he's very knowledgeable and works a lot very closely with people, because their service they provide for specifications and help on site is free, and that can give a lot of comfort to people when they're doing repainting or painting jobs. But great to have you all the way from Germany. That's brilliant. We've had wow, such a wide reach for a small town in Scotland. It's amazing.
I live in Scotland.
Oh, okay. That's a little bit more obvious.
I live close to Aberdeen. So.
Okay. Well, still a little bit further away then.
Yes. Thank you.
If I may make a comment there, well done, lovely presentation. Dermot Collier's my name. Hi, Roz. I've done a few of your courses and that sort of thing. I'm from Dublin in Ireland. The Kime, I've used the Kime paint over the years and similar mineral-based products and found them very good. But the only thing I would be worried about is that if they're used on stone, that it's not reversible. It's very hard. You can't get rid of it. Yeah. And it's great on, it's great if you have a rendered finished or whatever, and you can use a mineral-based product on it. But for stone, I don't like to see a product being used like a mineral-based or any paint over stone, because it's not reversible, and that's.
Another thing to point out, Dermot, that if you compare lime wash finishes with mineral paints, they don't have that lovely glow that lime wash has because of the double refractive index of calcite. And no other paint system can rival the look of you achieve with lime wash.
Yeah, and with the lime wash is sacrificial, and it has to be redone or whatever, but it's not traditional. And it's like your mortars. There's places for every system, And well done, guys. Great presentation, very informative, and
thank you.
I've listened to a lot of presentations, and this is one of the ones I rated up there very high. Well done.
Oh, great! That's such good feedback. Thank you. I think if there's no more questions, we might just wrap it up there. And I think Emma put a link in the chat for feedback, but I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, Emma, just to ask people for feedback.
I believe that Lime Centre are going to send out their normal feedback form, and I've added a couple of questions onto that. So that will have all the details, but I will, before I leave, put up my last slide again, so that you can have that. But if there's anything you'd like to get in touch with me about, very happy. We will deal with your queries. We will relay you on to the Lime Centre. Thank you, everybody, so much. Brilliant questions. And yeah, thank you very much for attending today.
Okay, well, yes, to echo what Emma was saying, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It has been an interesting day. I always learn something, even though I've done these myself and listened to them thousands of times. You always learn something new. And yes, very good questions. So thank you for that. And I think we will just bid you farewell, and so you can get away and have some lunch. So thanks, everybody, and have a good weekend.